He walked into the most important interview of his life carrying a stuffed rabbit and a 6-year-old girl. The room laughed. 24 hours later, he was the only thing standing between a billion-dollar CEO and the people trying to destroy everything she'd built. This is the story of Nathan Carter, the single father they dismissed, the man they underestimated, and the moment one small forgotten toy changed the fate of an entire empire. If this story finds you tonight, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor of Orion Capital Systems at exactly 7:53 in the morning, and the first thing Nathan Carter noticed was that everyone in the waiting area was wearing shoes that cost more than his monthly rent. He noticed things like that. It was part of how his mind worked, cataloging details, reading environments, running quiet assessments of spaces and people before anyone had said a single word. It was a habit built over years, sharpened by necessity, and it had saved him more than once in places far less comfortable than a corporate lobby with climate-controlled air and abstract art that probably had a name he'd never learned to pronounce. He stepped off the elevator and adjusted the strap of Emma's backpack on his left shoulder. Her actual backpack, the one with the cartoon astronaut on it, because the daycare had called the night before to say the boiler was out and they wouldn't be open until noon, and his sister hadn't picked up her phone, and his neighbor, Mrs. Ferris, had a doctor's appointment she'd scheduled 3 weeks ago, and he absolutely was not going to ask her to cancel it. So Emma had come with him. Emma, who was 6 years old and currently holding his hand and staring at the ceiling with her mouth slightly open because there was a chandelier up there shaped like a constellation, and she had recognized, without any help, that it was Orion. "That's us," she'd whispered in the elevator, pointing up before the doors even opened. "That's our name?" He hadn't corrected her. It wasn't their name, technically, but he'd learned not to correct Emma when she said things that were accidentally profound. The receptionist at the front desk, a young man in a fitted gray suit, looked up when Nathan approached, and his eyes did a quick practice sweep. Nathan watched it happen. The assessment took maybe 2 seconds. The slightly worn dress shoes, the interview suit that fit well but wasn't new, the child. "Good morning," Nathan said. "Nathan Carter. I have an 8 o'clock interview for the executive assistant position." The receptionist blinked once. "Of course." He typed something. "And is she—" "My daughter, Emma. She'll sit quietly. She has a book and headphones and a snack. She won't be a problem." Emma looked up at the receptionist and said solemnly, "I'm very well behaved in professional settings." Nathan had not coached her to say that. He genuinely did not know where she had heard the phrase professional settings. But the receptionist's expression did something complicated, caught between amusement and uncertainty, and he directed them to the waiting area with a slightly warmer tone than he'd started with. The waiting area had 8 chairs arranged in a loose arc facing a frosted glass partition. 6 of those chairs were already occupied. Nathan found 2 seats near the corner. He always preferred corners, lines of sight in multiple directions, and got Emma settled with her headphones and her book about deep-sea creatures. She found the anglerfish page immediately. It was her favorite. She said the anglerfish was proof that ugly things could still be useful, which was another thing he hadn't taught her and sometimes wondered about. Then he looked around the room. The other candidates were exactly what he'd expected, and also somehow worse. Not worse in the sense of being bad people. He had no evidence for that and wasn't in the business of judging strangers. Worse in the sense of being so aggressively, uniformly polished that the room had a specific texture to it, like a showroom where everything was positioned to be impressive and nothing was actually meant to be touched. The man directly across from him was maybe 35, dark suit, silver watch, the kind of haircut that communicated ambition without quite saying it out loud. He was reviewing a leather-bound portfolio with tabs, color-coded tabs. He caught Nathan looking and gave him a brief nod that managed to be simultaneously professional and dismissive. The 2 women to Nathan's left were clearly not together. They sat with a careful distance between them that suggested they'd already identified each other as competition. But they had a similar quality, the kind that came from years of operating in rooms that demanded a specific presentation. Both were dressed impeccably. Both had the focused, slightly elevated stillness of people who had prepared extensively and knew it. There were 2 more men across the room, one scrolling his phone, one with his eyes closed in what might have been meditation or might have been a power nap, and one more woman near the far wall who was making quiet notes in a slim notebook and had so far not looked up at anyone. Nathan pulled out his own notes, not a leather portfolio, a folded legal pad with handwritten observations he'd made over the past 4 days since getting the interview call. He'd looked up Orion Capital Systems, not just the surface stuff, the press releases and LinkedIn pages and glossy investor materials, but the actual filings, the compliance history, the board structure, the executive movement over the past 18 months. He'd read 3 separate analyses of the pending Voss Meridian merger. He'd pulled up the SEC disclosures. He'd gone through the company's documented security protocols in a trade publication interview Evelyn Sterling had given the previous spring. He'd had 4 days and insomnia. He'd used them. Emma tapped his arm. He looked down. She held up her book and pointed at the anglerfish. She'd taken out one earbud. "Did you know," she said in her serious voice, "that the light on its head is actually bacteria? It doesn't make the light itself. The bacteria does. And the fish just uses it." "I did not know that," Nathan said, which was a lie, because Emma had told him this exact fact 11 days ago. But she deserved to tell it. "So the fish gets the light," Emma said, "and the bacteria gets a safe place to live." She considered this. "That's a good deal." "Put your earbud back in, Bug." She put her earbud back in. She turned back to her book. The man across the room with the color-coded portfolio was watching this exchange with an expression Nathan didn't look at directly because he didn't need to. He could see it fine in his peripheral vision. The first candidate was called in at 8:04. Color-coded portfolio. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked through the frosted glass door with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times and expected to win. They called the next one 10 minutes later. Then the 2 women, one after the other, each called just as the previous one re-emerged, controlled, giving nothing away, the faces of people who'd been trained not to telegraph outcomes. The man who'd been on his phone, the woman with the notebook. Nathan watched each of them go in and each of them come out. He was cataloging the way he always did, not sizing them up for competition. He'd made his peace with the gap between what he was offering and what they were offering. He was watching for something else, something about the room itself. The way the frosted glass caught the light when the door opened. The security panel beside it, biometric reader, model he recognized, installed sometime in the past 6 months, based on the micro-scratching pattern around the fingerprint sensor, which meant a recent security upgrade. The camera in the upper left corner of the waiting area, which had a slightly different housing than the ones he'd seen in the lobby downstairs. Different vendor, maybe, or different installation date. He made a small note. Emma had fallen asleep against his arm. He let her sleep. They called his name at 9:47, which meant he'd been waiting for almost 2 hours and was the last interview of the morning. This was not an accident. He suspected it was a test, though possibly not a deliberate one, more likely just a consequence of the fact that the assistant who'd scheduled these interviews had put him last because he was the lowest percentage candidate on paper, the one they'd taken a chance on mostly because the recruiter had flagged him as unconventional, and unconventional was sometimes a useful word for maybe not terrible, but we can't quite justify why we feel that way. He gently woke Emma. "Time to go in," he said. She surfaced from sleep the way she always did, fast, fully oriented, no confusion. She'd been like that since she was a baby. She sat up, straightened her own little jacket. He'd bought her a small blazer at the consignment shop 2 days ago, navy blue, because she'd asked to match him, and said, "Ready? Remember what we talked about," he said. "Sit quietly. Don't talk unless someone asks me something. If someone asks me something, answer politely and then stop talking. And don't touch anything on the tables. Good. And if I'm bored, I can draw in my notebook. Good." She picked up her notebook and her stuffed rabbit, a faded gray and white rabbit named Professor Hops, who had been through more than most stuffed animals, and showed it, and they walked through the frosted glass door. The conference room on the other side was large, glass-walled on 2 sides. with the city spreading out below in that particular way that expensive floors and expensive buildings had of making the world look like it had been arranged for your benefit. The table was long and dark, and there were 4 people seated along one side of it. Nathan identified them in the first 3 seconds. The woman in the center was Evelyn Sterling. He'd seen enough photographs to know her face. Early 30s, sharp-featured, the kind of compose that read as either confidence or armor, depending on what you were looking for. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately read, which he noted. Most people were readable quickly. She wasn't. To her left, a man in his late 40s, heavy-shouldered, with the particular settled authority of someone who had been in the same organization long enough to believe his continued presence was the organization. Victor Hale, operations chief. Nathan had read about him. The merger had Hale's fingerprints on a lot of procedural elements, which he'd found worth noting. To Evelyn's right, a younger man, early 30s, with an open face and a very good suit and the easy, practiced warmth of someone who understood charm as a professional instrument. Nathan didn't know who this was, not someone he'd encountered in his research. He filed that gap. At the far end, a woman with a tablet who appeared to be HR, and who looked up at Emma and then looked at Nathan with the expression of someone who had not anticipated this complication and was not yet sure whether it was a large complication or a small one. Nathan put Emma in one of the chairs against the side wall, away from the table, her notebook, and Professor Hops arranged in front of her. And then he turned to the panel and said, "Good morning, Nathan Carter. I apologize for the unconventional situation. My childcare arrangement fell through this morning, and I didn't believe the right response was to cancel." A beat of silence. The younger man, not Victor, the other one, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He turned it into a cough. It wasn't convincing. Victor Hale was looking at Emma. His expression was the professional version of dismissal, the kind that didn't say anything out loud because it didn't need to. The HR woman was typing something very small and careful on her tablet. Evelyn Sterling said, "Please sit down." Nathan sat down. She said, "You understand this role requires round-the-clock availability, emergency response, international travel on short notice, the kind of schedule that doesn't accommodate personal complications." She said personal complications without any particular inflection, but the word choice was deliberate, and he knew it. "I understand the requirements of the role," Nathan said. "I have a system." A system," Hale repeated in a tone that made the word sound like a punchline. "Yes. A coverage network. 3 people, documented protocols, response times I've tested. Emma has never been a reason I failed to show up somewhere I needed to be." He paused. "I didn't bring her here because I couldn't manage my situation. I brought her here because the alternative was canceling this interview, and I thought that would be worse." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "What makes you think you're qualified for this role? Your background is not—" She glanced at the file in front of her. "In corporate executive support. It's in risk assessment, close protection, logistics management. I spent 8 years working in environments where a missed detail was the difference between a functioning operation and a failed one. I can read a room, a document, a schedule, a communication chain, and I can find what's wrong before it becomes a problem." He looked at her directly. "That's what you actually need in an executive assistant at this level. Not someone who can file beautifully. Someone who can see what you're about to walk into before you walk into it." Silence. Emma, against the wall, was drawing in her notebook. She was completely absorbed. Nathan noticed peripherally that she was drawing what appeared to be the chandelier from the lobby. "Tell me something wrong about this room," Evelyn said. The younger man blinked. Hale's expression shifted slightly. Not impressed, not yet, but something had changed in the angle of his attention. Nathan looked around the room, took his time. Then he said, "The security panel by the main door was installed in the last 6 months. Different vendor than your lobby system. That's not unusual. Upgrades happen. But it means there's a gap in your integrated monitoring during the transition period. Whoever manages your security protocols should know that panel isn't fully synced to the building's main system yet." He paused. "Also, the draft agenda for this afternoon's stakeholder call is visible on the screen behind you. If this were a media interview or a competitor-adjacent meeting, that would be a problem." No one looked at the screen immediately, but the HR woman turned slightly. Evelyn Sterling did not look at the screen. She was looking at him. "Go on," she said. Nathan put his notes on the table. "I reviewed the structure of the Voss Meridian merger," he said. "I'm not a finance person. I want to be clear about that up front, but I know how to read operational risk, and there are some procedural elements in the compliance documentation that I'd want to understand better if I were sitting in your chair. Specifically, that information is not public," Hale said sharply. "The SEC filings are." The trade publication interview, Miss Sterling gave in. March laid out the general compliance framework. The analyst report from Bridgewater Associates made certain assumptions about the signing process that implied a specific procedural structure. Nathan kept his voice even. "I made inferences. Some of them might be wrong. But the ones about the document verification chain are worth asking about." The room was quiet in a different way now. Victor Hale had a very controlled expression that was doing a great deal of work. Evelyn Sterling had her hands flat on the table, and she was still looking at Nathan in that way he couldn't quite decode. The younger man, who had not said a word in several minutes, was watching Nathan with an expression that had moved through several phases and was now somewhere Nathan might describe as careful. "Okay," Evelyn said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." She made a note. "We'll be in touch." It was not the warmest dismissal Nathan had ever received, but it wasn't the coldest either. He knew what it meant. He gathered his folder, stood, said thank you to each person at the table, but not effusively, just clearly, because his mother had taught him that much and he'd held on to it, and crossed to the side wall to collect Emma. Emma had finished her drawing. She held it up for him to see. It was the chandelier, the Orion constellation. She'd gotten the stars in roughly the right positions. "Good?" she whispered. "Really good," he said quietly. She put Professor Hops under her arm, took his hand, and they walked out. In the elevator going down, Emma asked, "Did we do okay?" Nathan looked at the floor numbers descending. "I think we did what we could." "That man with the gray hair didn't like you." "No." "He kept looking at you like Mrs. Calloway looks at the Henderson's dog." Nathan almost smiled. "That's a pretty accurate description." "Do you think you got it?" He thought about Evelyn Sterling's face when he'd described the security panel, the quality of the silence when he'd mentioned the compliance documentation, the way she'd said, "Go on." "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not. But they heard something today." "What did they hear?" The elevator opened on the lobby. The chandelier hung above them, casting fractured light across the marble floor. "That we showed up," he said. Nathan did not get the position. He found out at 4:17 that afternoon, via email. 3 sentences. "Thank you for your time. We've decided to move in a different direction. We wish you the best in your search." He read it at the kitchen table while Emma was in the other room watching a nature documentary about octopuses, her current secondary obsession after deep-sea fish. He could hear the narrator talking about camouflage, about how the octopus could become, in an instant, identical to its environment, invisible and completely undetectable. He read the email twice. Then he closed his laptop. He hadn't expected to get it. He'd told himself that before he went in. He'd tried to believe it. But somewhere around the moment when Evelyn Sterling had said, "Go on," he'd let himself think, just briefly, that something different was possible, that the observation about the security panel had landed, that the merger analysis had meant something, that the thing he actually offered, the real thing, had been visible enough. He should have known better than to let himself think that. He made Emma's dinner. He helped her with her reading. He put her to bed. She didn't ask about the job again. She seemed to sense, with the particular accuracy of children who have learned to read a parent's quiet, that it wasn't a night for more questions. But before he turned out her light, she pushed Professor Hops to the edge of the bed and said, "He doesn't like sleeping in my backpack. He told me." Nathan picked up the rabbit, set it on the pillow next to her. "Better," Emma confirmed. He turned out the light. He went back to the kitchen and sat there for a long time without turning any lights on, listening to the apartment settle around him, going over the interview in his head the way he always went over things, looking for his mistakes, looking for what he should have done differently, looking for the thing he'd missed. He'd almost convinced himself to stop thinking about it when he remembered the note. Before leaving the conference room, he'd written something on a single page of his legal pad and left it folded on the table. Not as a stunt, not as a power move, because he'd sat there for 40 minutes cataloging the room, the people, the strange angle of Victor Hale's attention when certain topics came up, the way the younger man's ease was almost too consistent, too maintained. And something had accumulated in his chest that he didn't know what to do with except write it down. He'd kept it short. He wasn't a dramatic person. Ms. Sterling, this is not part of my interview, and I understand it may seem presumptuous, but I've spent the last 8 years learning to recognize when a room is telling me something important. In this room, I saw something that concerned me. Someone inside your organization is interested in this merger in a way that goes beyond their professional role. That interest is not aligned with yours. I cannot prove this, but it's real. And I'd ask you to be careful before the signing. N. Carter. He'd written it because he didn't know what else to do with what he was seeing. He'd left it because not leaving it would have bothered him more. He didn't know if she'd read it. He didn't know if she'd taken it seriously. He suspected not. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 6:15. He did not sleep well. The morning came gray and cool, the particular flatness of a day that hasn't decided yet what it wants to be. Nathan made coffee, checked his email, nothing, and was sitting at the table with his mug and his notepad when Emma came out of her room. She was still in her pajamas. She was carrying her backpack. "I'm getting ready," she announced. "Okay." He looked at the backpack. "You can leave the bag. Mrs. Ferris is taking you to the park today." "I want to bring my stuff." "That's fine." He watched her start to unzip it. "Emma." She looked up. "Where's Professor Hops?" She looked at the backpack. She looked at her room. She looked at the backpack again. Her face went through 3 changes in about 2 seconds, and Nathan knew every one of them. She disappeared back into her room. He heard her moving things. He heard the sound she made when she was looking for something and not finding it. She came back to the door. "He's not in my room." "You had him on your pillow last night." "I know." Her voice was getting tight. "He's not there now. I looked everywhere." Nathan thought back. He'd taken Professor Hops off the pillow and handed him to Emma after she'd brushed her teeth. She'd put him in... Where? She'd put him in the backpack. The astronaut backpack, the one she'd brought to the interview. He ran through the morning of the interview, the waiting room, Emma's seat by the wall. He'd collected her bag, her notebook, He'd collected her bag and her notebook. The rabbit had been on the seat next to her. He closed his eyes for 1 second. "We left him," he said. Emma stared at him. "At Orion," he said, "in the conference room. He was on the chair next to you." Emma didn't cry. She was not generally a child who cried quickly. But she went very still in the way she went still when she was deciding something, when she was sorting through feelings to figure out which one was going to be in charge. "We have to get him," she said. "I know." "Today." "I know." He was already running the math. The 42nd floor. The morning. The merger signing. He'd read enough to know it was scheduled for some time today, though he didn't know the exact time. "I'll call and see if someone can hold him for us. We might not be able to go up there, Emma. It's a busy building and I don't work there." "You know people there." "I met people there." "That's different." She considered this. "Professor Hops has been with us since the hospital," she said. Not dramatically, just stating a fact, the way she stated facts about anglerfish. Nathan knew exactly when and why she'd gotten Professor Hops. He didn't say anything. "I'll figure it out," he said. He called the main reception number for Orion Capital Systems at 8:45. He was transferred twice and then disconnected. He called back, explained the situation to a different receptionist, and was told someone would look into it and call him back. No one called back. At 9:30, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with her breakfast barely touched, turning her empty hands over and over, the way she turned Professor Hops over and over when she was thinking. Nathan looked at her hands. He picked up his keys. "Get your shoes," he said. They took the bus. Emma sat beside him, not talking, which was unusual enough that the man in the seat across the aisle kept glancing at her. She wasn't upset in a visible way. She was contained. She'd gone somewhere interior and quiet, and he'd learned not to try to pull her out of that place before she was ready. He was running his own calculations. The lobby of Orion Capital Systems at 10:15 in the morning was more crowded than it had been 2 days before. There was a different energy, not chaotic, but faster, directed. The particular compression of a building where something significant was happening and everyone was adjusting their orbit around it. Nathan noticed the security desk had 3 people instead of 2. He noticed 2 men in near-identical dark suits near the elevator bank who were not carrying anything and not talking to anyone, just standing at slightly wrong angles to the room, too alert, too still. Close protection, private, not building security. He noted this. He went to the reception desk and explained the situation. His daughter, the stuffed animal, the conference room on 42. The receptionist was polite. She checked something on her screen. She apologized, but the 42nd floor was restricted access this morning. There was a significant corporate event underway. Perhaps someone could bring the item down? She would send a message. Nathan looked at the elevator bank. He looked at the 2 men in suits. He looked at the receptionist, who had the expression of someone who had delivered this particular refusal and expected it to work. "Thank you," he said. He took Emma's hand and moved away from the desk. They stood near the lobby seating area. Emma looked up at the Orion chandelier again. This time, she didn't say anything. Nathan was looking at the security layout. He was looking at the elevator access card reader. He was looking at the second elevator bank, service elevators behind a frosted partition that he'd noticed on his way out 2 days ago. Service elevators in buildings like this one ran on a different access system than the executive elevators. Different contractor, usually lagged on the software integration. He'd noticed the security camera housing on 42, different vendor than the lobby. He'd written it in his notes. He looked at Emma. "Stay close," he said, "and be very quiet." She looked up at him with her serious face. "Okay," she said. Quote, "The service elevator required a key card, but the door to the service corridor beside it was propped open. A delivery cart nearby, boxes stacked against the wall, no one in immediate sight. Nathan walked past it without slowing, registered the layout, noted the stairwell access at the far end. He wasn't trying to break in. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was going to get a stuffed rabbit from a conference room on a floor he had no legitimate access to, and he was going to bring it back to his daughter, and then he was going to go home. That was the plan. He took Emma's hand. They went through the service corridor. They took the stairs. 42 floors of stairs would have been unreasonable, and he hadn't planned for it. On the 14th floor, the stairwell connected to a secondary corridor he'd seen referenced in the fire safety diagram posted by the ground floor exit. Older buildings like this one had secondary access routes that didn't appear on the main floor plans but were documented in the fire system. He'd looked at the fire system documentation. He had a problem, he knew, with noticing things. He found the route he needed. It involved a maintenance corridor on the 38th floor, an elevator that ran between 38 and 42 for equipment transfer, and a keycard access panel that was running on the older software. It took him 11 minutes. He felt the entire time like he was doing something wrong, because technically he was. He was also doing the only thing that made sense given the information he had. These 2 things had coexisted in his life before. Emma did not ask questions. She moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, kept her hand in his, and kept her mouth closed. She understood somehow that this was serious, that this was not a game. When the elevator opened on 42, Nathan went still immediately. The floor was different. 2 days ago, it had been a quiet executive floor. A few people, background activity, the hushed carpet and glass quality of a floor designed to project control. Now there were people everywhere, not chaos, directed movement, specific, purposeful. People with tablets and folders. A tech crew running cables near the far conference suite. 3 men and a woman stationed at irregular intervals in the corridor in that same deliberately casual way the men downstairs had been standing. More close protection. And the conference room, not the one he'd interviewed in, a different one, larger, at the far end of the corridor, had its glass walls opaqued. Privacy glass. Switched on. Nathan backed into the alcove by the elevator. He thought, the merger signing, today. He'd known it was today, but not the time. And it was happening in there, or about to happen in there. And there was security everywhere, and he was standing on a floor he had no right to be on, with his 6-year-old daughter holding a half-eaten granola bar she'd apparently produced from somewhere. "Dad," Emma said quietly. "I know." "Professor Hobbs." "I know, Bug." He looked down the corridor, the room he'd interviewed in, smaller conference room, third door on the left. He could see it from here. The door was closed, but there was no one stationed near it. No privacy glass. He thought about the note he'd left. He thought about what he'd written. He thought about what he'd seen in that conference room 2 days ago. Hale's attention when the compliance framework came up, the younger man's maintained ease, the gap in his own research where the younger man should have been. He thought about the things he hadn't included in the note because he hadn't been sure enough. The way the security camera housing was different on this floor. The way the access panels were running on mismatched software. The way a lot of small things, when you stacked them up carefully, pointed in a direction that made his chest tight. He stood in the alcove and looked at the opaque conference room at the end of the hall. Something was wrong. He'd felt it for 2 days. He'd written a note about it. He'd gone home and made dinner and put his daughter to bed and told himself he'd done what he could. The rest wasn't his problem. He didn't work there. He had no standing. He had no proof. He was still standing here. Emma pulled his hand. He looked down at her. She was looking at the smaller conference room, the one they'd interviewed in, and then she was looking at him. And her expression was doing that thing where she was asking him something without words, the way they'd gotten good at since it was just the two of them. Are we going to do the right thing? He didn't know what the right thing was. He knew what he saw. He knew what the stack of small observations was telling him. He knew that somewhere at the end of that corridor, behind opaqued glass, something might be about to go very wrong for a woman who hadn't given him the job, but who had said, "Go on," like she actually wanted to hear what he had to say. He thought about the rabbit. He thought about how Emma still had her hand in his. "Okay," he said quietly. "Stay right here, right in this spot. Don't move." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to try something," he said. "If someone comes and tries to take you somewhere, say you're waiting for your father. Say my name. Say it loudly." "Nathan Carter," she said clearly. "Good girl." He looked at the corridor. He looked at the close protection personnel, counted them, mapped their patterns. They were watching the main elevator bank, not the alcove, not the maintenance route exit. He had maybe 90 seconds before someone's sweep brought them back this direction. He moved. He did not run. Running was always wrong. It flagged threat. It drew eyes. It changed the entire quality of a situation in an instant. He walked with the specific quality of someone who belonged somewhere, the way he'd learned to walk in rooms where he didn't belong but needed to. The deliberate measured pace of a man on his way somewhere specific with a purpose he'd already decided on. He made the conference room door in 20 seconds. He opened it. Professor Hobbs was on the chair by the wall, right where Emma had left him. But that was not the only thing Nathan saw when he opened the door. On the table, the long, dark table he'd sat across 2 days ago, was a laptop running a document comparison tool. The screen was not locked. The documents were open. He was not a legal person. He was not a contracts person. But he'd spent 4 days reading the Voss Meridian merger documentation, and he'd read enough to know what the original agreement structure looked like. What was on the screen was not the original agreement structure. He had maybe 60 seconds, probably less. He looked at the documents. He found the clause in 40 seconds. It was buried. Not clumsily, professionally, the way you buried something when you were skilled and careful and had access to the right systems. In the original agreement, the voting rights structure maintained Evelyn Sterling's controlling interest through a specific trustee mechanism. In the revised document on the screen, that mechanism was altered. 3 words changed, a definition modified, a reference to a third-party trustee that hadn't existed in any document he'd read before. The third-party trustee was a shell entity. He didn't know that for certain. He couldn't know it for certain in 45 seconds. But the name was constructed like a shell entity, a jurisdictional designation that meant nothing, a registration format he'd seen before, and due diligence work from his previous life. If Evelyn Sterling signed the version on that screen instead of the original agreement, she would believe she was securing her position. She would be transferring it. Nathan picked up Professor Hobbs. He took a photograph of the screen with his phone. He left the room. He went back to the alcove. Emma was exactly where he'd left her. She saw the rabbit, and something in her face went immediately, physically soft with relief. Not childishly, not dramatically, just the release of something that had been held tight. She took Professor Hops under her arm and hugged him once, hard, without making a sound. Nathan looked at his phone. He looked at the opaque conference room at the end of the corridor. He thought, "This is not my problem. I have no proof that's what I think it is. I have 45 seconds of looking at a document I barely understand. I could be wrong." He thought, "But I wrote her a note, and everything the note said is true." He thought about sitting in a chair across a table while Hale looked at Emma like she was an inconvenience, while the younger man with the easy smile turned Nathan's most careful observations into something to be handled and set aside. He thought about how much he'd have preferred to go home. Then he started walking toward the opaque conference room, and he didn't slow down, and he didn't let himself think anymore, because thinking was no longer useful, and movement was. The security person nearest the door, a broad-shouldered woman, 30-ish, earpiece, the specific boredom of someone in the third hour of a stationary post, registered him at about 20 feet. "Sir, I need to see Ms. Sterling," Nathan said, without stopping. "Sir, this area is—" "I have information about the document she's about to sign. It's been altered. I have proof." He held up his phone. He did not stop walking. "If I'm wrong, you can remove me, but you want to make that call in the next 60 seconds. She had very good instincts. He could see her running the calculation, weighing the options, working out what the consequence of being wrong in either direction looked like. "Wait here," she said. She opened the conference room door. She went in. Nathan waited. Emma was beside him. He hadn't told her to stay in the alcove again. She'd simply come with him, quiet and watchful, Professor Hops under her arm, her eyes moving between Nathan's face and the opaque door with complete trust. 10 seconds. 20. The door opened. The security woman said, "Come in." Nathan went in. The conference room was large and arranged for a formal signing. The long oval table, name placards, a tablet at one position with the electronic signature interface already loaded and waiting, a revised document displayed on the screen at the far end. 3 executives he didn't know. A legal team of 4. Victor Hale, standing near the far wall. The younger man, the one with the easy smile, whose name Nathan still didn't know, seated to the right. And Evelyn Sterling, standing at the head of the table with the signature tablet in her hand, who looked up when Nathan walked in and whose expression moved through 3 rapid changes. The third one was the only one that mattered. The third one was, "You came back." "I got about 30 seconds of your time," Nathan said, "before someone throws me out. So I'm going to need you to look at this." He held up his phone. The room erupted. Hale said, "Security?" The younger man said, "Who the hell is—" One of the legal team stood up, but Evelyn Sterling raised one hand and the room went quiet. She looked at Nathan's phone. She looked at his face. "Talk," she said. The room did not go quiet the way rooms go quiet in movies. That clean cinematic silence where everyone stops at once and the air itself holds still. It went quiet the way real rooms go quiet, when something unexpected lands in the middle of a carefully arranged situation. In pieces, unevenly, with a couple of people still talking for 2 or 3 seconds after everyone else had stopped, until the absence of the others caught up to them, and they trailed off and the quiet became complete. Victor Hale was the last to stop talking. He'd been saying something about security and unauthorized access, and the legal implications of allowing an unvetted individual into a confidential signing session. He was good at it. The sentences were structured, controlled. The voice of a man who understood that tone was half the argument. But Evelyn's hand was still raised, and eventually even Hale's voice ran out of room. Nathan stood at the end of the table with his phone and did not look at Hale. He looked at Evelyn. She had not moved. She still had the signature tablet in her hand, and she was looking at his phone screen, the photograph he'd taken of the document comparison on the laptop in the other room. She hadn't taken the phone from him yet. She was reading it from 2 feet away, and he watched her eyes move across it with the particular focus of someone who was not just reading, but confirming something she'd already suspected and had hoped not to confirm. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Conference room down the hall. The laptop was open. I wasn't looking for it." "What were you looking for?" He held up his other hand, the hand that was holding Professor Hopps. The room absorbed this information in various ways. One of the lawyers made a sound that couldn't quite decide if it was disbelief or laughter. The younger man, Brandon, Nathan would learn his name later, looked at the rabbit and then at Nathan and then at Evelyn with the expression of someone rapidly calculating the distance between where things were and where they needed to be. Hale said, "This is absurd." Not loudly. Controlled. "Whatever he thinks he saw." "Brandon?" Evelyn said. Brandon looked at her. "The revised compliance annex," she said. "The one that came through this morning described as a procedural update. I want you to pull up the original trustee language." Something moved through Brandon's face, quick and small, gone before most people in the room would have caught it. Nathan caught it. "Evelyn, we've been through the document. Pull it up," she said. Her voice hadn't changed volume or register. That was what made it land the way it did. She wasn't raising it. She was just removing all the softness from it, the cooperative quality, the collaborative CEO cadence she probably used in 80% of her professional interactions. What was left was something simpler and harder. Brandon picked up his tablet. It took 11 minutes. Nathan stood near the door for those 11 minutes. Emma had positioned herself just inside the room, against the wall beside him, and she was quiet and still in the way she'd been quiet and still in the waiting room 2 days ago. Not frightened, not rigid, just absorbing everything with those serious eyes of hers. Professor Hopps was back under her arm where he belonged. She'd tucked him in tight without even looking down at him, a reflex, the way you settle something familiar without thinking. The legal team was doing what legal teams do when the ground shifts under them, pulling documents, cross-referencing language, talking to each other in the clipped shorthand of people who know a problem is real and are now calculating its dimensions. 2 of them were on phones. One was typing hard and fast on a laptop that hadn't been opened 5 minutes earlier. The 3 executives Nathan didn't know had moved instinctively toward each other, a cluster near the far window. Witnesses to something they hadn't anticipated and weren't sure yet what they were supposed to do with it. Hale had not moved from his position by the wall. He had not said anything since Evelyn told Brandon to pull up the document. He was watching the room with the expression of a man who had prepared for a great many contingencies and was now working through which ones still applied. Nathan watched him do it. He'd seen that kind of composure before. It wasn't innocence and it wasn't panic. It was calculation wearing the face of patience, and it took a certain kind of person to maintain it under these conditions. Nathan gave him credit for it in the same impersonal way you gave someone credit for a technical skill that was being used against you. Evelyn was at the head of the table with the original agreement and the revised version side by side on her tablet. She had not asked Nathan anything further. She had not looked at him again after the first minute. She was working, and the quality of her focus was absolute. The kind that excluded everything peripheral, the kind that came from years of operating at a level where missing a detail had real consequences. One of the lawyers, older, silver-haired, the senior partner energy of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years, said quietly, "There." And then nothing else, because Evelyn was already there, had been there probably 20 seconds before he pointed it out. She read the clause. She read the 3 changed words. She read the definition modification and the third-party trustee reference. The room waited. "Room's name," she said, without looking up. "The trustee." "What's its registration?" The younger lawyer who'd been typing looked at her screen. "Cayman Islands, registered 8 months ago. One named director, nominee." "Who filed the registration?" Typing. "The filing agent is..." A pause. "The filing agent is a corporate services firm out of Luxembourg. Cross-referencing?" More typing. "I need more time for the chain." "Take the time," Evelyn said. She set down the tablet. She picked up the signature tablet, the one that had been loaded and ready and waiting, and she set it face down on the table. The gesture was small. The room felt it like something physical. Nathan did not know, standing there, exactly what he'd expected to happen once he walked through that door. He'd been operating on a 10-second time horizon the whole way across the corridor. Enough to get to the next thing, then the next, then the next. He hadn't thought past show her the photograph. He had no plan for the space on the other side of that. So he stood by the door while the room worked around him, and he tried to make himself as unobtrusive as possible, which was difficult given that he'd just walked into a confidential signing session carrying a stuffed rabbit, and was still standing there, and was clearly the reason the signing had stopped. Emma shifted beside him. She'd noticed, he could tell by the slight change in her posture, that they had been standing for a long time, and no one had told them they could sit down or leave, or that any decision had been made about them at all. She didn't say anything. She just adjusted her grip on Professor Hops and settled in for more waiting, because she'd been doing that her whole life, and she was better at it than most adults he knew. He put his hand briefly on top of her head. She leaned slightly into it. The senior lawyer said, "Evelyn." His voice had a quality Nathan hadn't heard from him yet, something that wasn't quite urgency, but was moving in that direction. "The trustee entity. The filing chain leads to a domestic holding company, cross-referenced against board filings." He stopped. Evelyn looked up. The lawyer looked at her, and then, briefly, involuntarily, at Victor Hale. Hale's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. The most minute adjustment, the kind most people would never notice, like a structure that has been bearing weight shifting its load onto different supports. Nathan noticed. The room noticed the lawyer's look. Not all of them understood what it meant yet, but the look landed, and the silence that followed it had a different quality than the silences before it. Heavier, more specific, with a shape. Brandon said, "This is... Evelyn, I want to say clearly that I had no... Sit down, Brandon," Evelyn said. He sat down. Hale said, in the same controlled voice he'd been using all along, "Whatever you think the chain indicates, there are explanations you haven't considered. I'd strongly recommend reviewing the full documentation before drawing conclusions that could have serious legal implications." "Victor," Evelyn looked at him. "Stop talking." He stopped. And Nathan saw it. The first real crack in the composure. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, letting go of one small part of itself. The face was still controlled. The eyes were not. They asked Nathan to wait outside. Not harshly. Evelyn's head of security, a different person from the woman who'd let him in, a compact, quiet man who materialized from somewhere Nathan hadn't clocked, came to the door and said, "Ms. Sterling would like you to remain available. Could you and your daughter wait in the conference room down the hall?" "The one with the rabbit," Emma supplied helpfully. The security man looked at her. "Yes, that one." They went down the hall and sat in the smaller conference room, and someone brought a bottle of water and a plate of cookies that Emma regarded with the seriousness of someone evaluating their options, and then chose 3, and ate them systematically while Nathan sat across from her and stared at the table. He didn't know what was happening in the other room. He didn't have enough information to know. He had a photograph of a document he'd looked at for 45 seconds and a read on a room he'd been in for 11 minutes. He might have the whole thing completely wrong. There might be explanations he hadn't considered. Hale's own words, though that wasn't a great endorsement. The trustee chain might resolve to something ordinary. The changed words might be a drafting error that meant less than he thought. He kept coming back to Hale's eyes. He kept coming back to the way Brandon had said, "I want to say clearly that I had no and hadn't finished the sentence because the sentence finished would have been a confession." Emma said, "Are we in trouble?" "I don't know," he said. "Are you sure you read it right? The document?" "No," he said. "I'm not sure." She considered this, cookie in hand. "But you came in anyway." "Yeah." "Why?" He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest and also appropriate for a 6-year-old. He thought about it for a while. "Because not going in felt worse," he said finally. Emma processed this. "That makes sense," she decided. She finished her cookie. She picked up Professor Hops and looked at him. "He's okay," she said. "Not scared or anything. He was just waiting." Nathan looked at the stuffed rabbit, worn at the joints, one eye slightly lower than the other from a repair he'd made 2 years ago with the wrong color thread, the fur on his ears compressed from years of Emma holding them. "Glad he's okay," Nathan said. She set Professor Hops against the water bottle so he was upright and facing the room. "He wants to see what happens," she explained. 40 minutes later, the security man came back. "Miss Sterling would like to speak with you." Nathan stood. He looked at Emma. "Stay here this time. Actually, stay." "I know," she said. She had her notebook open. She was drawing the table. She'd given Professor Hops a seat at it. He followed the security man back down the corridor. The large conference room had changed. The executive cluster by the window was gone. The legal team was still there, but smaller now. Two of them still at the table with documents, one on the phone near the window with the lowered voice and careful word choices of someone managing a situation. Two of the close protection people were still positioned near the walls, but differently. Their attention had shifted, reoriented, pointing toward new considerations Nathan couldn't fully map. Victor Hale was not in the room. Brandon Pierce was not in the room. Evelyn Sterling was standing at the far end of the table with her arms crossed and her weight on her back foot, which he was coming to recognize as her thinking posture. The specific physical arrangement of someone who was processing at full capacity and needed her body to hold still so her mind could move. She looked up when Nathan came in. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He couldn't read her face. He still couldn't, and he'd been trying since the interview. She was one of the most genuinely difficult people to read he'd encountered in a long time, and he'd spent years working around people who were professionally trained to conceal their states. "The trustee entity traced to a holding company with 2 beneficial owners," she said. "One of them is Victor Hale. The other is a consulting firm that has received significant payments from Voss Meridian in the past 14 months. She paused. "The document revision was submitted through our internal legal workflow using credentials that will take time to fully trace. But the revision itself, and the trustee structure it created, would have transferred effective voting control of Orion to a third party aligned with Voss Meridian's interests within 18 months of the signing." Nathan said, "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "For what?" "That it's true," he said. "I was hoping I was wrong." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the exhale that sometimes substitutes for one when a laugh would be the wrong thing. "You weren't wrong." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at the table. "You left a note," she said. 2 days ago, before you left the interview." "I know." "Did you know then? What you're telling me now?" "No," he said honestly. "I knew something was misaligned. The note was—" He tried to find the right word. "It was what I could prove," which wasn't much. But leaving without saying anything felt irresponsible. She was quiet for a moment. "We gave the position to Brandon." "I know." The email was 3 sentences. Something moved through her expression. Not apology, not yet. Something working toward it. Brandon was aware of the document revision. He wasn't the architect. He was a conduit. He understood enough to facilitate and not enough to understand he was going to be the one left holding it when the structure fell apart. She paused. Or he understood and decided the short-term calculation favored him. "I don't know yet. The review will determine it." "He seemed smart," Nathan said. "I'd guess the second." She looked at him. "You read that in 11 minutes. "I read a lot of things in that room," he said. "I tried to write the most important one down." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "What were you actually doing up here this morning?" He held up Professor Hops, which he'd been carrying since the smaller conference room. He'd forgotten to leave it with Emma. Evelyn looked at the rabbit, at the worn fur and the mismatched eye and the compressed ears. Something crossed her face that was different from anything he'd seen there before. Less composed, more unguarded, the expression of someone encountering something they hadn't made room for. "She left him in the chair," Nathan said. "During the interview. I didn't notice until this morning." "You came back for a stuffed rabbit." "Yes." "And accidentally stopped a corporate takeover." "I wouldn't say accidentally," he said. "I'd say additionally." This time the sound she made was an actual laugh. Brief, unpracticed, the kind that escaped before she could decide whether to allow it. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment, and then lowered her hand and looked at him with the expression of someone who was recalibrating something. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. She sat across from him. Not at the head of the table, just across, the way two people sit when they're going to talk rather than when one of them is conducting a formal assessment of the other. "I want to ask you something honestly," she said. "Okay." "In the interview, when you described the security panel and the camera housing, were you doing that for the job or because you actually saw it?" "Both," he said. "I actually saw it. I mentioned it because it seemed relevant. I understood I was also in an interview, but I wasn't going to invent something to impress you." "And the merger analysis? 4 days of reading. Some of it was inference. I told you that." "The inferences were right. Mostly," he said. "I didn't know about the trustee structure specifically. I just knew the compliance framework had a gap that someone could use if they wanted to." She was looking at him with the direct quality that he'd noticed in the interview. The full attention, unmediated, not performing anything. It was uncomfortable in the way that any complete honesty is uncomfortable. He looked back. "Why did you apply for this role?" she said. Not accusingly, genuinely. "Because I needed a job," he said. "Because the role matched what I'm actually good at. Because—" He paused. He decided to be honest about this too. "Because I read your profile and you seemed like the kind of person who wanted someone who could actually do the work, not just look like they could." "What made you think that?" "The interview you gave last spring, the trade publication. You talked about protocol compliance in terms of outcome rather than process. Most executives talk about it the other way around. They care whether the boxes are checked. You cared whether this building was actually safe." He looked at the table. "I thought that meant you'd value someone who saw the same things." "I was wrong about that." "A beat." "You weren't wrong about what I valued," she said. "You were wrong about whether I'd act on it under pressure." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's a fair distinction." She was quiet for a moment. "Victor was with this company for 11 years, she said. It came out differently than the earlier statements. Less reported, more personal. The particular weight of a betrayal that had been sitting for the last 40 minutes and hadn't had anywhere to land yet. He helped build the operational infrastructure. He was in the room for every major decision I've made in the last 4 years." Nathan didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "He understood every vulnerability we had," she said. "Every gap, every timing issue in a process, because he helped design the processes." She looked at the table. "He was very good at his job." "That's usually how it works," Nathan said. The person who knows where the vulnerabilities are is also the person most capable of exploiting them." She looked up at him. "Is that from experience?" "Yes." He didn't elaborate. She seemed to decide, from his tone, that elaborating wasn't necessary. "The merger review will take weeks, possibly months. There's going to be a significant amount of reconstruction, legal, operational, reputational. Voss Meridian will dispute our characterization of what happened. Their counsel is already in contact with our legal team, based on what I'm hearing from across the hall." She looked at the door, briefly, toward the sound of the ongoing phone call. They anticipated this scenario too. They have a counter-narrative prepared. "They would," Nathan said. "That means they've been planning this for at least several months. You need your own document trail. Original communications, workflow logs, everything with a timestamp before the revision was submitted. The comparison will hold up better if you can show the chain of custody on the original." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "But I appreciate that you know." A pause. "What are you doing next week?" she said. Nathan looked at her. He hadn't let himself make an assumption about where this conversation was going, because assumptions led to disappointment, and he'd been disappointed enough this week already. "Looking for a job," he said. "I mean after Monday," she said. "Specifically starting Tuesday, assuming the terms are acceptable to you, which I intend to make sure they are." He was quiet for a moment. "Brandon's position," he said. "Brandon's position no longer exists," she said. "A new position does, with scope appropriate to what I actually need, which is not a polished interface between me and the rest of the organization. It's someone who sees what I can't see in time to do something about it." She looked at him steadily. I should have understood that before. I was given all the information I needed to understand it. I chose not to, for reasons that were about optics and internal politics, and, frankly, assumptions I made that I am not proud of. That's on me. Nathan thought about the email. 3 sentences. We've decided to move in a different direction. He thought about the night he'd sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He thought about Emma's hands turning over and over, the way they turned Professor Hopps. I have conditions, he said. I assumed you would. I need a predictable daily schedule as the baseline. I'll work outside it when the situation requires it, and it will require it. I understand that. But Emma needs to know where I'll be. Reasonable. My availability system, the coverage network I mentioned in the interview. I need it respected. There will be moments where I hand off to someone in my network, and that handoff is not negotiable in an emergency. Also reasonable. And he stopped. This was the harder one. Not harder to say, but harder because it was the one that mattered most and was also the one most likely to be agreed to in this moment and forgotten in practice. Emma is not a liability. She's not a complication. She's not the thing I'm working around. If she comes up in a professional context, the way she came up in that interview room, the way people looked at her, the way your operations chief looked at her. Victor Hale, Evelyn said, in a tone that made his name sound like a file being closed, no longer has a professional context at Orion. I know, Nathan said, but the attitude doesn't leave when the person does. I need to know that the workplace she comes into contact with. I understand what you need, Evelyn said, not cutting him off, but landing on the sentence with the full weight of meaning it. I was in the room too. I saw how she was treated. I didn't say anything about it. She met his eyes. That's something I intend to correct directly, not just as a policy matter. He looked at her. The expression on her face was the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her in 2 days. Not comfortable, not performed. The specific quality of a person saying something they mean in full knowledge that meaning it and doing it are 2 different things, and they're committing to both. Okay, Nathan said. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. Her grip was firm and quick, the handshake of someone who had been doing it long enough that it was automatic. But there was something slightly off rhythm about this one, a hesitation at the start, barely perceptible, the kind that happens when the gesture carries more weight than usual and the body registers it even when the face doesn't. He registered it. He didn't say anything about it. Tuesday, she said. 8 o'clock. I'll be there, he said. Emma won't. I know, she said, and for the first time something crossed her face that was close to warmth. Careful, contained, but real. Though the rabbit is welcome. Nathan stood. He picked up Professor Hopps. He looked at the table, the document still spread across it, the signature tablet face down, the whole careful architecture of a scheme that had come within 60 seconds of working. One more thing, he said. She looked up. The security camera on this floor, he said. The one with the different housing. You need to get someone in here to audit the full integration. If Hale was involved in the recent security upgrade, there may be gaps in your monitoring that are more deliberate than procedural. She looked at him for a moment. You noticed that in the waiting room. 2 days ago, he said. I made a note. She looked at him for another moment. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way a camera would necessarily catch. Just the quiet recalibration of a person who is adjusting what they thought they understood. Tuesday, she said again. He went back down the hall. He went back to the small conference room. Emma had finished her drawing. She'd drawn the whole room. The table, the chairs, Professor Hopps at the head of it, and 2 small figures by the door that were recognizably her and Nathan. She'd drawn them the same height. He looked at the drawing. We okay? She said. Yeah, Nathan said. We're okay. He set Professor Hopps in her arms. She held him, and he watched something in her small face settle completely, the way it only settled when everything that needed to be in place was in place. And she looked up at him with her serious eyes and said, Can we go get lunch? I'm really hungry. Yeah, he said. Let's go get lunch. Tuesday came with rain, not dramatic rain, not the kind that announces itself. The quiet, persistent kind that made the city look like it had been watercolored in grays and made the commute into something to be managed rather than experienced. Nathan had been awake since 5:15, not from anxiety or not entirely from anxiety, partly from the habit of early waking that had calcified into permanence around the time Emma turned 2 and stopped sleeping through the night for a stretch of 8 months that he still didn't fully remember clearly, partly because he'd wanted time, before the day started, to sit with his coffee and go over everything he knew and didn't know about what he was walking into. He knew the basics of the role: executive protection, risk assessment, process oversight, the things he'd described in the interview, the things Evelyn had confirmed she needed. He knew the building, the floor plan up to the 42nd level, the security layout including the gaps he'd already flagged. He knew the merger situation was unresolved and that Voss Meridian's legal team had filed 2 motions in the 4 business days since the signing collapsed. He'd read the public filings. He'd made notes. What he didn't know was how to walk into a place that had laughed at him 8 days ago and treat it like a job. He didn't spend too long on that. It was a real problem, and it had no clean solution, so the best thing to do was acknowledge it and then set it aside and show up anyway. He was good at that. The showing up anyway part. It was possibly his most reliable skill. Emma was awake by 6:30. She ate her cereal with more focus than usual, which meant she was thinking about something she hadn't decided whether to say. He waited. "The people there," she said eventually. "The ones who were mean. Some of them aren't there anymore," he said. "But some are." "Yes, some are." She turned her spoon in her bowl. "What do you do when you have to work somewhere that was mean to you?" He thought about it. He gave her the real answer. You decide that what you're there to do is more important than how it feels to be there. And then you do it. And eventually it either gets better or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you make a different decision. She processed this. "That sounds hard." "It is." "Okay." She ate another spoonful. "I think you should do it anyway." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." He dropped her at school. He took the bus to downtown. He rode the elevator to 42 in his interview suit, the same one, because it was the best one he had. And he walked off into a floor that looked different than it had the week before in ways that were both visible and not. The visible part. The security setup had been updated. New panels, both elevator banks, and Nathan could tell from the cable routing near the ceiling that the camera system was mid-integration. Someone had taken his observations seriously and called in a contractor. The close protection people were different too. The ones who'd been there last Thursday were gone, replaced by a smaller team with a tighter physical footprint and better positioning. Someone had done a sweep and reorganized. The not visible part was harder to name. It was in the way people moved, the slightly elevated quality of alertness in the administrative staff, the office doors that were closed that hadn't been closed the week before. The particular atmosphere of a workplace that has discovered something was wrong inside it and is still deciding whether to be afraid or angry. He understood that atmosphere. He'd been in versions of it before. He found his way to a small office 2 doors down from Evelyn's main suite. It had a desk, a monitor, a clear sight line to the elevator bank, and to Evelyn's door simultaneously, a window. It was not large. It was practical, which he preferred. Someone had left a building access card on the desk with his name on it, and a single handwritten note from Evelyn that said, "Security audit findings on your desk by end of day. The contractor would like to speak with you at 10. E.S. Not a welcome, not a speech, a task. He sat down and got to work. The first 2 weeks were a process of calibration. For both of them. Evelyn operated fast, faster than Nathan had anticipated, and he'd anticipated fast. She processed information in real time, made decisions with a rapidity that was sometimes disorienting and occasionally brilliant, and then moved immediately to the next thing without looking back. It was an effective system. It was also a system with a specific blind spot, which was that moving fast created gaps, and gaps were where problems lived. Nathan's job, as he came to understand it in practice, was to stand in the gaps, not symbolically, literally. He reviewed every document before she signed it. He sat in on every substantive meeting and read the room the way he always read rooms, cataloging, assessing, looking for the thing that was slightly wrong, the tension that wasn't on the agenda, the person whose body language contradicted their words. He audited the communication chain, emails, calendar invitations, workflow approvals, for anomalies. He rebuilt the access log system for the 42nd floor so that every entry and exit was timestamped against a cross-referenced list. It was painstaking, unglamorous work. It was also exactly what he was good at, and the first time in a long time he'd been in a position where that was actually the point. What surprised him was Evelyn. He'd expected to have to argue for his findings. He'd expected the particular friction of someone who had agreed in principle to a thing, and then found, in practice, that having someone second-guess their processes was uncomfortable. He'd seen it before. The decision to accept scrutiny was always made in the abstract, and the actual experience of scrutiny was different. Evelyn was not like that. When he flagged something, she listened. When she disagreed with his assessment, she said so directly and explained why. When he was right and she knew it, she adjusted without making it into a larger moment than it needed to be. She didn't perform humility, but she didn't resist correction either. She treated it like information, which was what it was. He respected that more than he'd expected to. The thing that was harder, the thing neither of them fully addressed in those first 2 weeks, was the weight of what was still unresolved. Victor Hale had retained counsel. The investigation was ongoing and had expanded to include external forensic accounting, which meant it was both more serious and more slow-moving than anyone had hoped. Voss Meridian was fighting the characterization of their involvement aggressively. Their position, maintained through 2 layers of attorneys, was that any document revision had occurred without their knowledge or authorization, and that the trustee structure, while irregular, had a legitimate business rationale that had been mischaracterized in crisis conditions. It was a good position, as defensive positions went. It wasn't necessarily true, but it was structurally coherent and hard to disprove quickly. Nathan read the filings and made his own notes and passed them to the legal team with a brief cover memo that said, essentially, these are the places where their narrative requires assumptions that don't hold. The timestamps don't support the sequence they're describing. Whether the legal team used it, he didn't know. He was not in the legal team's orbit. He was in Evelyn's orbit, and his job was to keep that orbit stable while everything else was moving. The other unresolved thing was Brandon Pierce. Brandon had resigned the day of the failed signing. Voluntarily, technically, which meant the legal exposure was more complicated, the cooperation incentives more negotiable, the whole situation murkier than if he'd simply been terminated for cause. He had retained his own attorney. He was cooperating with investigators on a selective basis, which was the kind of cooperation that tended to mean, I'll give you what helps me, and nothing that doesn't. Nathan didn't have strong feelings about Brandon as a person. He'd met him for 11 minutes across a conference table. What he had was a clear read of the role Brandon had played, and it was not a passive one. Whatever Brandon claimed about the extent of his knowledge, he'd been in that room. He'd seen everything Hale had seen. He'd made calculations, and the calculations had been wrong, but they'd been made. Evelyn had strong feelings. She didn't express them directly, but they were there. In the clipped quality of her voice when Brandon's name came up in legal briefings, in the way she'd closed a file folder once when his attorney's letter was mentioned and taken a moment before reopening it. She was too controlled to let it show clearly, but Nathan was in the room when it happened, and he noticed. 3 weeks in, she came into the office on a Thursday morning with the particular energy of someone who hadn't slept well and didn't intend to acknowledge it. He'd seen this before. He'd learned not to ask directly. He put a coffee on her desk, not a production of it, just a cup, there when she sat down, and went back to the workflow audit he'd been running. She sat. She drank the coffee. She opened her laptop. After about 10 minutes, she said, without looking up, "The board is calling for an interim operations chief. They have 3 candidates." "I know," he said. "I saw the calendar invite for the review meeting." "I don't like any of them." He considered this. "Which part don't you like?" "All 3 have existing relationships with members of the board who are also on the Voss Meridian side of this dispute." She looked up. "I can't tell if that's politics or if it's the same architecture as what happened before, and I'm just recognizing it later." Nathan set down his pen. He looked at her. "Which one of those options is actually scarier to you?" She blinked. Not a common response from her. "What?" If it's politics, it's inconvenient but manageable. If it's architecture, you have a larger problem inside your board structure that's been there longer than Hale was. He paused. Knowing which one it is changes what you do about it. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know which one it is. Then we find out before the review meeting. He picked up his pen. Send me the background files on all 3 candidates. Not the ones HR compiled. The actual backgrounds, board affiliations, employment history, outside directorships. I'll look at the connection points. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd come to recognize, the one where she was recalibrating again, adjusting her read of what he was and what he was capable of. That's not technically in your job scope, she said. No, he agreed. Do you want me to do it anyway? A pause. Yes, she said. He did it. It took him 2 days and cost him sleep he didn't have. What he found was not a conspiracy. He wanted to be precise about that when he presented his findings, because precision mattered and he wasn't going to overstate. But it was a pattern that warranted attention. 2 of the 3 candidates had indirect financial relationships with a consulting firm that had received payments from Voss Meridian. The relationships were not hidden. They were simply not visible unless you pulled 4 different sets of filings and laid them end to end. He put it in a memo. 3 pages. He tried to write it the way the old version of himself would have written a field assessment. Factual, qualified, no conclusion beyond what the evidence supported. He put it on her desk before she arrived on Friday morning. When she came in and read it, she was quiet for a long time. The 3rd candidate, she said finally. Hartley. Clean as far as I can tell. He doesn't have the board relationships. His outside directorships don't overlap with anything Voss Meridian adjacent. His management style is considered difficult, she said. I've heard that from 3 people. Difficult is a complicated word, Nathan said. It sometimes means actually difficult. It sometimes means honest in a way that inconveniences people who'd prefer not to be. She looked at the memo. She looked at him. You think it's the 2nd? I think it's worth finding out before you let the board make the decision for you. The Hartley conversation took place on a Friday afternoon in late October, when the rain had finally committed and the city outside was doing the thing it did in fall where it became simultaneously more beautiful and more exhausting. Nathan sat in on the initial meeting at Evelyn's request. He sat in the corner, away from the table, and said nothing. He watched. Hartley was 53, thick-set, with the particular directness of someone who had given up somewhere along the line on softening what he thought. He'd been in operations management for 25 years. He had opinions, and he stated them plainly. He told Evelyn within the first 10 minutes that the operational gap left by Hale was significant, and that filling it with someone who didn't have full authority to restructure the affected systems would be a mistake, regardless of how uncomfortable that restructuring was for people who'd been there a long time. Evelyn said, "What makes you think I'd resist that?" Hartley said, "You've been CEO for 4 years. You've made significant changes in structure and personnel, but you've consistently maintained the operational frameworks that predate you, including Hale's frameworks. If I come in and recommend dismantling them, that's going to be uncomfortable." Evelyn said, "I'm aware of that." Hartley said, "I want to know, before we go further, whether awareness and tolerance are the same thing for you in this context." The room was quiet. Nathan watched Evelyn absorb this, watched her decide how to respond to being challenged directly in a job interview that she was technically conducting. "They are," she said, "within reason." Hartley said, "Define reason." She said, "The restructuring serves the company's interest, not your discomfort with systems you didn't design." He looked at her. "That's fair." He nodded once. "I can work with that." After Hartley left, Nathan and Evelyn sat in the conference room for a few minutes in the particular quiet of a conversation that has ended but hasn't quite finished processing. "He's right," Evelyn said, "about the operational frameworks. I kept them because Hale was there, and I trusted the architecture because I trusted him." Nathan didn't say anything. "That's how it works," she said. Not a question. You trust the person, and the trust transfers to the systems they built. And you stop looking at the systems because looking feels like questioning the person. "Yes," he said. She was quiet. "Is there anything in this building," she said, "that you think I should be looking at that I'm not?" He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which meant not overstepping and not understating. The communication protocols between your legal team and the board subcommittee, he said, specifically around the merger dispute. The information flow is asymmetric in a way I'd want to understand better. It might be nothing. It might be standard attorney-client compartmentalization, but I'd want to know which one. She looked at him. How long have you been sitting on that? 10 days, he said. I wanted to be sure I understood what I was seeing before I said it. And now you're sure. Sure enough to mention it, not sure enough to characterize it. She exhaled. It was not a frustrated exhale, more the exhale of someone who is perpetually adjusting to the experience of being told accurate things they didn't ask to know. All right, she said, look at it. Tell me what you find. He looked at it. What he found took a week and a half and involved pulling email metadata, calendar logs, and the document access history for the merger dispute files. What he found was not a conspiracy. It was something smaller and, in some ways, more corrosive, a pattern of selective information sharing that suggested 2 members of the board subcommittee were receiving legal updates that were not being routed to Evelyn or her direct counsel. Not hiding information, routing it differently. The distinction mattered legally, but in practical terms the effect was the same. Decisions were being made in a room she wasn't in, based on information she wasn't getting. He put it in a memo. 4 pages this time. He spent more time than usual on the qualifications, what he could demonstrate, what he was inferring, where the evidence stopped and interpretation began. He wanted the precision to be obvious because what he was describing, if he was right, was serious. And serious things deserved careful language. He put it on her desk on a Wednesday evening and went home. She called him at 7:43 from her office. He was making Emma's dinner. He put it on low and stepped into the hallway. I need you to walk me through the timeline, she said. Now? Yes. He walked her through it. He was in the hallway for 22 minutes while Emma ate her dinner and watched a documentary about jellyfish. When he finished, Evelyn was quiet for a moment. 2 of the 4 board members on the subcommittee are actively working against the resolution of this dispute, she said. Not a question, stating it. They're working toward a resolution, he said carefully. It may just not be the one that's in your interest. Another silence. He could hear her thinking, not literally, but he'd come to recognize the quality of her silences, the difference between the ones where she was processing and the ones where she was deciding and the ones where she'd already decided and was simply completing the form of the pause. How did you see this? She said. The access timestamps on the legal files. The meeting calendar showed 4 subcommittee meetings in the past 6 weeks. Only 2 of them appear in your shared calendar. The other 2 don't have any record of what was discussed. That asymmetry, 4 meetings, 2 undocumented, is what I started with. That's a very small thing to start with. Yes, he said, but small things that don't fit are usually telling you something. She was quiet again. Then she said, Are you happy in this role? He blinked. It was not a question he'd expected. Yes, he said. And then, because it was true and he was trying to be honest with her, more than I expected to be. Why did you expect less? He thought about the lobby, the candidates in the waiting room, the interview panel, the email with 3 sentences. I thought the version of this job where I was actually useful might be harder to find than the job description made it sound. It usually is, she said. I've had 3 executive assistants in 4 years. 2 of them were excellent at the visible parts of the job. Neither of them saw anything. Some people don't see things, he said. They're not worse at their jobs for it. They just see different things. But I needed someone who sees what you see. Yes, and I almost didn't hire you because of Emma. He was quiet. I need to say that directly, she said. Not as a legal acknowledgement, as an honest statement of what happened. You were the most qualified person in that room for what I actually needed, and I almost dismissed you because of a 6-year-old girl and a stuffed rabbit and what other people in the room were going to think about it. He stood in the hallway. He looked at Emma through the gap in the kitchen doorway. Her serious face bent over her food, her jellyfish documentary playing, Professor Hops propped against her water cup. She's not a liability, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. I know that now, Evelyn said. I want you to know that I know it, not just as a policy. He took a breath. He didn't know what to do with that, with the direct quality of it, the absence of softening. He'd spent a long time in situations where he had to argue for the most basic facts of his life, and being told without argument that one of those facts was understood was strange and uncomfortable in a way that was not unpleasant, but was unfamiliar. Okay, he said. Tell Emma. She stopped. She seemed to be choosing the words. Tell her that the chandelier in the lobby is named for the constellation she identified, and that the building's original architect specified Orion because it's one of the few constellations visible from both the northern and southern hemispheres at the same time. He wanted the building to feel accessible from anywhere. A pause. I thought she might find that interesting. Nathan looked at the kitchen doorway, at his daughter. She will, he said. Good night, Nathan. Good night. He went back into the kitchen. He finished making dinner. He sat across from Emma while she told him, at some length, that jellyfish have no brains and no hearts and have been on the planet for 500 million years, which meant they had outlasted every mass extinction on record. That's quite a fact, he said. They don't need brains, she said. They just respond to things, like something hurts them and they move away. Something good is near and they move toward it. She considered. That's basically a brain, actually. Just a really simple one. That is basically a brain, he agreed. Evelyn, Emma said carefully, like she was testing the name. She'd started doing this recently, using first names for people she'd filed under important without his prompting. Does she have a simple brain or a complicated brain? Complicated, he said. Does she use it right? He thought about the phone call. I need to say that directly. About 4 weeks of watching someone adjust what they thought they understood in real time, without drama, without making it anyone else's problem. More than she did when I met her, he said. Emma seemed to find this an acceptable answer. She went back to her documentary. He sat at the table and thought about what had been built in 4 weeks. The audits, the memos, the slow reconstruction of a company's trust infrastructure from the inside out. He thought about what was still coming. The Voss Meridian dispute, the board situation, the Hartley restructuring, the dozen smaller things he'd cataloged and hadn't finished examining. He thought about how he'd sat in this same kitchen a month ago, in the dark, reading a 3-sentence email. He thought about how different things looked when you were looking from inside something rather than trying to get in. Emma's documentary reached the part about jellyfish blooms, the phenomenon where thousands of them gathered in the same water column, their motions synchronized without any communication between them, each one simply responding to the same conditions at the same time, creating together something that none of them could have been alone. Emma said, "That's kind of beautiful." "Yeah," Nathan said. "It is." He picked up his pen. He opened his notepad to a fresh page. He had a lot of work still to do, and the evening was quiet, and he was exactly where he needed to be. The Voss Meridian dispute went public on a Monday in November. Not because anyone at Orion chose to disclose it. The legal strategy had been careful, deliberate, managed to the degree that a thing involving this many lawyers and this much money could be managed. It went public because someone on the Voss Meridian side chose to let it, and the form it took when it landed in the financial press was not the version Nathan had been reading in the internal filings for 6 weeks. The version that hit the wire services at 6:47 on a Monday morning described Orion Capital Systems as a company in internal crisis following the abrupt departure of its operations chief, a failed merger that sources characterized as collapsing due to internal disorganization, and a CEO whose decision-making in the critical final stages of a billion-dollar deal had raised questions among board members and institutional investors. Victor Hale was described in one piece as a longtime executive whose departure came amid unspecified internal disputes. Not a conspirator, not an architect of document fraud. An operational leader who had left under unclear circumstances while the company's flagship deal fell apart. Brandon Pierce was not mentioned at all. Nathan read the first article at 6:52 while standing in his kitchen in yesterday's clothes because he'd been up since 4 working on the board communication analysis and hadn't quite managed to go to sleep. Emma was still in her room. The apartment was quiet except for the rain that had started again overnight and the specific kind of silence that meant his phone was about to start going. It started going at 6:58. Evelyn. He answered. "I've seen it," he said. "All of it?" "3 pieces so far. The Journal, the Bloomberg item, and the trade publication column. The trade column is the worst. It quotes 2 unnamed board members expressing concern about leadership stability." She was quiet for a moment. "The 2 board members whose meetings weren't on my calendar." "That would be my guess," he said. "I can't confirm it, but the characterization in the column matches the framing I'd expect from the subcommittee communications I documented." "So they didn't leak to pressure me into a settlement," she said. "They leaked to pressure the institutional investors into pressuring me." "Yes, that's a faster mechanism. Investor anxiety moves quicker than legal process." "How bad is the investor side going to be?" He thought about it honestly. "Bad enough to require direct response within 48 hours. The institutional holders who have been patient through the investigation period are going to need communication from you personally, not from IR, not from legal, from you, that explains what actually happened and what the path forward looks like. If they get that in a clear, factual way, most of them will hold. If they don't get it and are left reading this..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I have a board meeting at 10, she said. "I know. The 2 subcommittee members will be there." "I know. I'd like you in the room." He thought about that. He was not technically a board meeting participant. His role did not extend to board governance. But she'd said the same thing about the Hartley interview and the communication audit and the candidate background analysis. That's not technically in your scope. And each time the scope had shifted to accommodate what was actually needed. "I'll be there," he said. 7 pages, she said. "The materials packet for the meeting. I want you to read it before 10 and tell me anything I'm missing." "I'll have it read by 8:30. She hung up. He put the phone down. He looked at Emma's closed door. He did the math on time. He could read the materials and get Emma to school and be back on 42 by 9:15 if he didn't stop for anything and if the bus ran on schedule, which was its own variable. He started the coffee. He sat down with his laptop. He read fast. The board meeting at 10 was in the main boardroom, 1 floor up from the executive suite, a room Nathan hadn't been in before, larger and more formally arranged than the conference rooms below, with a long table that could seat 20 and currently seated 14. The 2 subcommittee members Nathan had flagged, a man named Gerald Forsyth and a woman named Caroline Abt, were seated midway down the table on the same side, which was either coincidental or an old habit from being in alignment with each other. Nathan sat against the wall to the left of the door, where he could see both the table and the entrance. Evelyn opened the meeting without preamble. She did not perform composure. She simply had it, which was different, and the distinction was visible if you knew what you were looking for. She laid out the situation in the factual, sequential way she'd been doing in every internal communication for the past 6 weeks. What the document revision had contained, what the forensic investigation had established, what the legal dispute with Voss Meridian currently looked like, and what the path to resolution required from the board. She did not editorialize. She did not assign blame in the meeting room. She stated facts and their implications, and she moved through them at a pace that didn't allow the room to drift. Forsyth waited until she'd finished the overview and then said, "I think the question most of us are sitting with is whether the current leadership structure is positioned to manage what is becoming a significant reputational and operational crisis simultaneously." He said it in the tone of a man raising a reasonable concern, which was the most effective way to raise an unreasonable one. Evelyn looked at him. "Clarify what you mean by current leadership structure." "Your office specifically," Forsyth said. "The decisions made in the final stages of the merger process, the personnel changes, the ongoing dispute, these all trace back to decisions made at the top." "The document fraud traces back to Victor Hale's decisions," Evelyn said, "which have been documented forensically. I'm happy to walk through that documentation again if it would be helpful." "What I'm saying," Forsyth said with careful patience, "is that the environment in which that fraud was possible is a leadership question." "It's an oversight question," Evelyn said. which is why we now have a dedicated risk and oversight function that didn't exist before. She didn't gesture toward Nathan. She didn't need to. The board members who'd read any of the internal communications in the past 6 weeks knew the role existed. The structural gap that allowed the manipulation to go undetected has been addressed. The question of whether it gets addressed at the legal and board governance level is what I'm asking this room to engage with today. Caroline Apt said, "Several of our institutional partners have reached out this morning. The press coverage has created concern." "I'm aware of the press coverage," Evelyn said. "I'm also aware of its origin. I'd be happy to discuss that separately." She held Abt's gaze for a moment, not aggressively, just precisely, with the specific stillness of someone who has named a thing without naming it and is waiting to see if the other person moves. Abt did not move. The meeting continued. Nathan watched it. He watched the room the way he always watched rooms. The alliances visible in the small physical agreements, the slight nods and redirected eye contact that told you who was coordinating with whom. He watched Forsyth and Apt, and he watched the other 12 board members, and he built a rough map of where the room actually sat versus where it was positioned. What he found was more complicated than he'd expected. Forsyth and Apt were running a play. He was confident of that, but the board was not uniformly with them. Several members were clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the challenge. The chairwoman, a 70-year-old woman named Ruth Calloway, who had been on the board since before Evelyn's appointment, had not spoken since the opening and was watching the room with the expression of someone who had seen this particular kind of meeting many times and was taking notes. After 40 minutes, Calloway said, "I'd like to propose we table the leadership discussion and focus on the legal resolution strategy. We have forensic evidence, we have a legal team with a clear position, and we have a CEO who has managed an extremely difficult situation with, in my assessment, considerable skill. The question before us is how we support the resolution, not whether we revisit decisions that have already been made and cannot be unmade." The room absorbed this. Forsyth started to say something. "Gerald," Calloway said, in a tone that was not unkind and also was not negotiable, "we'll discuss your concerns in the appropriate committee. This is not that committee." Forsyth closed his mouth. The meeting moved on. Afterward, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Evelyn stopped walking and stood near the window at the end of the hall and looked at the city for a moment. Nathan stood nearby. He'd learned not to fill her silences, which was a harder discipline than it sounded. "Calloway," she said finally. "She's been watching," Nathan said. "She knew." "She's known for a while," Evelyn said. "She came to my office 2 weeks ago and asked me to walk her through the communication audit findings in detail. I thought she was doing due diligence. She was deciding. She decided in your favor. This time." Evelyn turned from the window. "Forsyth is not done. This was a probe. He was testing what he could move in the room, seeing who would follow. When the answer was not many, he'll recalibrate." "Yes," Nathan said. "What does recalibration look like for him?" Nathan thought about it. "He needs the investor pressure to land harder before the next board meeting. Which means the press coverage this morning is the opening, not the whole thing. There'll be follow-up, additional sources, probably an analyst note from someone with relationships on the Voss Meridian side. He'll try to create the narrative that institutional holders are losing confidence before they actually are." "How long does that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Enough time for one news cycle to confirm another." She was quiet. "Then we don't have 2 or 3 weeks." "No, you need the investor communication to go out today, before the market closes, and it needs to be specific enough that it takes the narrative space the press pieces were trying to occupy." She looked at him. "Draft it," she said. "That's not in my scope, yes." She said it without impatience. "Draft it anyway. You know what needs to be in it. You've read everything." He drafted it. He sat in his office for 2 hours and wrote the clearest thing he knew how to write. Not legal language, not corporate communication language, the kind of clear, direct English that said exactly what happened and what was being done about it and what the company looked like on the other side. He qualified what was still unresolved. He did not overstate the certainty of the outcome. He made the factual case that the company's fundamentals were intact, the fraud had been isolated and addressed, and the legal dispute was a process with a defined path. He put it on her desk. She read it in 8 minutes. She made 4 changes: word level, precision adjustments, one sentence restructured for legal clearance. She sent it to counsel for a 30-minute review. It went to the institutional investors at 3:47, 43 minutes before the market closed. Nathan was in his office when it went out. He pulled up the trading feed, not because it was his job, but because he was human and the outcome mattered, and he wanted to know. He watched the Orion ticker for 20 minutes. It dipped 3 points in the first 10 and then held, and then over the last 15 minutes of the session, it recovered 2 of those 3. Not a triumph, but a hold, which was what they needed. He closed the feed. He started on the next thing. November moved into December the way that month always did, faster than it should, with the particular compression of a year reaching its end and everything that hadn't been resolved yet suddenly acquiring urgency. The Voss Meridian legal dispute reached a phase where the forensic accounting findings were formally submitted to the relevant regulatory bodies, which meant the dispute was now in a different kind of motion, slower, more institutional, less vulnerable to the kind of week-by-week narrative management that had occupied so much of the past 2 months. Nathan did not relax. He was not built for relaxing when something was in motion, and this was still in motion. But the acute quality of the threat diminished, and in its place there was the more manageable, if still substantial, work of reconstruction. Hartley had been in the operations chief role for 6 weeks, and was doing exactly what he'd said he would do, which was restructure things in ways that were uncomfortable for people who'd been in the systems a long time. He had the directness of someone who did not believe comfort was a meaningful professional goal, and he applied it consistently and without favoritism, which created friction and also created results. Nathan watched the operational audits come through and found that Hartley's changes were eliminating, one by one, the specific kinds of procedural gaps that had allowed Hale's manipulation to go undetected. He told Hartley this once in the elevator going down to the lobby, not a formal communication, just an observation, because it seemed worth saying. Hartley looked at him. "That's the point," he said. "You seeing it is how I know it's working." "I'm not usually told that directly," Nathan said. "I don't see the value in indirection," Hartley said. The elevator opened. He walked out. Nathan stayed in the elevator a moment longer, thinking that he and Hartley were, possibly, the same kind of person occupying very different professional registers. The thing that changed in December, not in the investigation, not in the board dynamics, not in the legal process, was something smaller and harder to categorize. It was a Tuesday, 3 days before the winter break the company closed for. Evelyn had been in back-to-back meetings since 8 in the morning, and it was now 6:15 and the floor had largely emptied out, the way floors did in the late afternoon of a pre-holiday week when people had somewhere to be and the institutional permission to go there. Nathan was still at his desk because there were 3 outstanding items he wanted to close before the break, and because his evening was not complicated. Emma was at his sister's tonight, first sleepover she'd agreed to in months, which meant Nathan had the rarer thing, a night with no one to account to but himself. He heard Evelyn's office door open. He heard her walk to the window. He could tell by the rhythm of her steps, which he'd catalogued without intending to, the particular pattern of someone who moved with purpose and slowed down only when they were thinking. After a moment, she said from the doorway between their offices, "Are you still working?" "3 more items," he said without looking up. "It's past 6. I'm aware." She leaned against the doorframe. He could see her in his peripheral vision, still in the day's suit, the jacket off now, the particular quality of end of day that was different from the controlled composure of 9 in the morning, less armored, not less competent, just less performed. "Emma's at your sister's tonight," she said. He looked up. "How do you know that?" "She told me. Last Thursday. She was here picking you up, and she told me she was going to her Aunt Dana's for a sleepover, and she was nervous but also very excited." She paused. "She tells me things." Nathan set down his pen. "When did that start?" "Gradually." Something in Evelyn's expression was different in the low light of a half-empty office at 6 in the evening than it was at 9 in the morning in a board meeting. "She asked me once what my favorite constellation was. I told her Cassiopeia because it's easy to find and most people overlook it. She said Orion was better because it had a story." She paused. Then she came back the next week and told me she'd researched Cassiopeia, and it also had a story, and she wanted to tell me what it was. Nathan looked at her. Did she? For about 20 minutes. Something moved across Evelyn's face, involuntary, unguarded, the smile of a person who is caught by something before they can decide how to present it. She's not a shy child. No, Nathan agreed. She never has been. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I owe her an apology. You apologized to me. I know, that's different. She looked at her hands briefly. She was in that room. She sat against that wall and she watched people look at her father the way they looked at him. And she's 6 years old and she understood what she was seeing. Children always understand more than you think they do. She looked up. I should say it to her, not as a policy statement, as a person. Nathan thought about Emma's hands turning over in her lap, the way she'd gone quiet and interior in the elevator going down that day. She'd receive that well, he said. Would she? Emma doesn't hold grudges, he said. She observes, she files things, and she moves on. She's already moved on, but yes, she'd receive it well. Evelyn nodded. She straightened from the doorframe. She seemed about to go back to her office, and then she didn't. Have you eaten? She said. He considered the question. He'd had a sandwich at his desk at noon. Not since lunch. Neither have I. She picked up her jacket from the chair near the door. There's a place 2 blocks down that doesn't take reservations, and the tables are too small, and the lighting is insufficient, and the food is worth all of that. He looked at her. It's dinner, she said, in the tone of someone who is naming a thing precisely so it can't be misnamed. Because it's 6:15, and we've been here since 8, and neither of us has eaten, and that's a practical problem with a straightforward solution. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They walked out together. The elevator descended in silence that was not uncomfortable. In the lobby, the Orion chandelier threw its fractured light across the marble floor, and Nathan thought about Emma identifying the constellation before the doors had even opened, and about how she'd said, "That's us," with the conviction of someone who had recognized a belonging before she could explain why. The place 2 blocks down was exactly what Evelyn had described. Small tables, dim light, the kind of unremarkable exterior that hid a kitchen that knew exactly what it was doing. They got a table near the back. There was no waiting. The menu was 4 items. They ordered. The food came. They ate, and it was not a meeting, and it was not a debrief, and it was not a structured conversation with a purpose. It was 2 people at the end of a long day eating dinner and talking about things that were not work, or that were adjacent to work, or that were the kind of things you talked about when the professional scaffolding came down far enough that you were just people. She told him that she had grown up in a smaller city, one of 2 daughters, that her father had run a hardware store, and her mother had been an ER nurse, and she had come to business through a path that surprised people who assumed money led to money. He told her about the years before Emma, the work he'd done, the places it had taken him, the version of himself that existed before a 6-year-old girl had reorganized every priority he'd ever held. He did not tell her everything about Emma's mother. He didn't need to. She didn't ask. She understood somehow the shape of what wasn't being said, and she let it have its shape without pressing it. What struck him, sitting across a small table in insufficient light with mediocre wine and extraordinary food, was how different she was from the woman in the interview room. Not different in character. He'd seen, in flashes, who she was under the professional composure throughout the past 2 months. But this was the version of her that existed when there was no audience, no crisis, no assessment being performed. She was drier, funnier, more impatient with certain things, and more patient with others. She said what she thought without organizing it first. She made a mistake in a story she was telling and corrected herself without fussing over it. She was imperfect in the way that people were imperfect when they stopped trying not to be. He found it, unexpectedly, a relief. They walked back to the building to collect their things from the office. In the elevator, she said, "Forsyth is going to make another move before the end of the year." "Probably," he said. "He'll want to create the impression of instability before the Q4 earnings call. I want to be ready for it before it happens this time. I'll have something on your desk before the break." The elevator opened on 42. They walked to their respective offices. He collected his bag, his notepad, his phone. He heard her doing the same through the open doorway. Before he left, he stopped at the door frame of her office. She was putting on her coat, her back to him. "The investor communication," he said. "The one we sent before close. I want you to know that worked because of how you'd been managing the information environment for 6 weeks. I was able to draft it because you'd given me access to everything I needed to understand the full picture. A lot of people in your position don't do that." She turned. She looked at him. "It worked," he said, "because you let it work." She held his gaze for a moment. "Good night, Nathan?" "Good night." He went down in the elevator. He walked out into the December evening, the rain done now, the air cold and clean, the city doing the thing it did on clear nights when the lights from above competed with the lights from below, and neither quite won. He pulled out his phone to check his messages. Emma had sent a voice message from her aunt's phone at 5:47. He pressed play. "Dad, I'm okay. Aunt Dana made pasta, and it was really good, but not as good as yours. Professor Hops found a very comfortable spot on the bed. I wanted to tell you I'm okay because I know you worry when I'm not home. Also, I looked up Cassiopeia. Did you know the queen had to sacrifice her daughter to a sea monster because she bragged too much? That's a very extreme consequence. Okay. Good night. I love you." He stood on the sidewalk and listened to it twice. He put his phone away. He started walking toward the bus stop. The Orion building rose behind him, lit up against the December sky, all 42 floors of it, and he did not turn around to look at it because he knew what it looked like, and he'd be back on Tuesday, and there was work still to be done, and there always would be. He walked. He was, he realized, careful with the word, not trusting it too quickly. Something close to okay. Not fixed, not resolved, not the clean ending of a thing wrapped and finished. Just a man walking home through a December night with a job he was good at, and a daughter who left him voice messages about Greek mythology, and a feeling that the space he occupied in the world was, for the first time in a while, exactly the right size. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The regulatory findings came down on a Thursday in late January, and they came down hard. The Securities and Exchange Commission's formal notice arrived at Orion's legal department at 8:41 in the morning, and Nathan had it on his desk, summarized and cross-referenced against the 6 months of documentation he'd been building by 9:15. He read it twice. He made 3 notes. Then he walked to Evelyn's office and knocked on the open door and said, "You need to read this before your 9:30. She read it in 4 minutes. Then she set it down and looked out the window, and was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she went quiet, when something had landed that she'd been waiting for so long that the arrival felt different from what she'd expected. The findings confirmed what the forensic accounting had established in November. The document revisions submitted to Orion's legal workflow had been introduced using credentials belonging to Victor Hale through a system access point that had been deliberately left unpatched during the security upgrade, an upgrade Hale had overseen. The trustee entity traced through 3 jurisdictions before resolving to a holding structure with co-beneficial ownership by Hale and a financial intermediary with documented payment relationships to Voss Meridian. The revised clause, had it been signed, would have transferred effective voting control of Orion's core assets to the third-party trustee within 22 months of execution, at which point Voss Meridian's aligned interests would have held decisive influence over the company's strategic direction without ever appearing as a named party in the original merger agreement. It was, the regulatory document noted in the clipped language of official findings, a sophisticated and premeditated scheme. "Brandon," Evelyn said. Not a question. "Page 9, Nathan said. "He's named as a knowing facilitator. The findings distinguish between architect and conduit, but they're clear that his involvement was not incidental." She turned to page 9. She read it. "What does that mean legally?" For Hale, criminal referral to the DOJ, the SEC finding triggers it automatically at this level of fraud. For Brandon, civil exposure, possible criminal referral depending on the DOJ's assessment of the knowing facilitator finding. His cooperation reduced the exposure somewhat, but not as much as his attorney was probably hoping. She set the document down. Voss Meridian. Institutional liability is harder to establish when the scheme was run through an intermediary. Their counsel has been effective at maintaining separation. But the SEC finding creates reputational damage that functions independently of the legal outcome. and two of their major institutional holders have already indicated they're reviewing their positions. He paused. The merger itself is effectively dead, not just suspended. The environment for reconstituting it on any terms doesn't exist anymore. She nodded slowly. She'd known this. They'd both known this for months, but knowing a thing and having it formally closed were different. The board meeting is next week, she said. Yes. Forsyth. The regulatory finding takes the wind out of his argument, Nathan said. His position required the narrative that the crisis was a leadership failure. The finding establishes it was a fraud perpetrated against the leadership. Those are different stories, and the board knows it. She looked at him. Will he accept that? No, Nathan said, but he'll have to work with it. She picked up the document again. She held it in both hands without reading it, just holding it, the physical weight of 5 months of investigation and litigation and reconstruction made into paper. Then she set it down on the desk, smoothed it flat, and said, "Okay, what do we do today?" He told her. They did it. The board meeting on the following Tuesday was the quietest one Nathan had attended since the first. Not quiet in the sense of easy, quiet in the sense of a room that had already done its fighting and was now dealing with the outcome. Forsyth sat through the regulatory briefing with the expression of a man recalculating the terms of a negotiation in real time, and by the midpoint of the meeting he had shifted, with the practiced smoothness of someone who understood which direction the room was moving, from challenge to neutral inquiry. Not an ally, not a concession. Just a man who had decided this particular engagement was over and was preserving his position for the next one. Ruth Calloway moved the formal vote on the board's confidence statement at 11:47. It passed 11-2. The two who voted against were Forsyth and Apt, which was exactly what Nathan had mapped, and which told him that neither of them was going anywhere and that the next engagement would come when a new opportunity presented itself. He noted it. He filed it. He moved on to the next thing. After the meeting, Calloway stopped Nathan in the corridor. She was a small woman who carried herself with the particular uprightness of someone who had been in rooms like this one for 40 years and had learned that presence was not about size. "You're the one who found the communication asymmetry?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the candidate backgrounds?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I've been on this board for 11 years. In that time, I've watched 2 CEOs operate without anyone in the room whose actual job was to see what they couldn't see." She paused. "That's a structural vulnerability I should have flagged earlier." Nathan said, "You acted when it mattered." "I acted when the evidence was overwhelming," she said. "That's later than I prefer." She looked at him a moment longer. "Keep doing what you're doing." She walked away. Nathan stood in the corridor for a moment, thinking about what it meant to be seen by people you hadn't known were looking. February came. Then March. The rhythm of the work became, if not routine, then at least familiar. The audits, the assessments, the quiet cataloging of things that didn't quite fit. Hartley's operational restructuring reached the phase where it was producing measurable results. Response times in the compliance workflow, document verification chains, cross-departmental communication protocols. The gaps that had existed before were closing, one by one, replaced by systems that Nathan had helped design and that Hartley had implemented with his characteristic directness and zero interest in how people felt about the changes. The company was not healed. Companies didn't heal the way people sometimes imagined, clean and complete, returned to some prior state. What Orion was doing was something more accurate and more difficult, rebuilding differently, incorporating what had happened as information rather than pretending it hadn't, becoming a structure that was in some ways stronger precisely because its weak points had been found and addressed by force. Nathan understood this process. He'd done it himself years ago in different circumstances. The thing that broke you, if you worked with it long enough, eventually stopped being just the thing that broke you. He understood also that this was not comfortable to live inside, even when it was going in the right direction. Evelyn had difficult weeks. She had a week in February where the DOJ's preliminary inquiry into Hale's criminal referral required her direct testimony, and she spent 4 days in depositions describing conversations and decisions and moments of trust that had turned out to have been made on a false foundation. And when those 4 days were done, she came back to the office on a Friday afternoon and sat in her chair without turning on her computer for 20 minutes. Nathan left a coffee on her desk. He went back to his office. He did not ask. After 20 minutes, he heard her computer turn on. He heard her start typing. He went back to work. There was a day in March when she came into his office, not to the doorway, actually into the room, which was unusual, and sat in the chair across from his desk that was technically for meetings, but had become, over time, a place where things got said that were not official. "I have to testify again in April," she said. "I know. I have the calendar." The defense is going to argue that Hale's actions were enabled by organizational failures at the executive level. She looked at the desk. "They're going to try to make it about my oversight." "That's standard defensive positioning for a fraud case," Nathan said. "It doesn't hold up against the forensic timeline. The document revision was introduced through a system access point that was specifically concealed from executive oversight. That's in the regulatory findings." "I know." She was quiet. "I know that legally. What I'm working on is knowing it in the other way." He understood what she meant. He sat back in his chair. "The thing about being deceived by someone you trusted," he said carefully, "is that the deception working doesn't mean your judgment was bad. It means they were skilled and motivated and had time and access. Those are their attributes, not yours." She looked at him. "Is that something someone told you?" "No. It's something I worked out slowly and badly over about 2 years." He paused. "It'd be easier if it were faster, but that's not how it works." She was quiet for a moment. "You know more about what happened to you than you've said." "Yes." "You don't have to." "I know." Another silence. Outside the window, March was doing what March did. Undecided, oscillating, one day close to spring, and the next back to winter without apology. "Emma asked me," Evelyn said, "if I had a best friend." Nathan looked at her. "We were talking, right? She comes and finds me sometimes when she's here. If I'm not in a meeting, she brings Professor Hops. She shows me things she's drawn or things she's found interesting." She said this as though she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with the fact of it. This small person who had simply decided that Evelyn was someone worth finding. She asked if I had a best friend, and I said I had colleagues I was close to, and she said that wasn't what she meant. She stopped. I didn't know what to tell her. Nathan looked at his desk. He looked back at her. "What did you tell her?" "I said I was working on it." She looked at him steadily, and there was something in her face that was not performed, not composed, not managed, just present. She said that was a good answer. He held her gaze. "It is a good answer." She looked at him for another moment, then she stood. "The Westbridge Group wants a meeting. They're interested in a restructured partnership, not a merger, a strategic alliance. The terms would keep Orion's governance structure fully intact." She was back in CEO mode, not because she'd been performing vulnerability and was now putting on armor, but because she was a person who held both things at once and moved between them without pretending either one didn't exist. "I'd like you in that first meeting." "When?" "Next Thursday." "I'll be there." She walked out. He sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a conversation that had said more than it explicitly said, and then he picked up his pen and went back to work. The apology to Emma happened on a Saturday in late March, which was not planned and therefore was more real than a planned thing would have been. Emma had come with Nathan on a Saturday morning because he needed to collect materials from the office before the Westbridge preparation meeting started Monday. And Emma had, in her practical way, declared that she would like to come because she wanted to see the new fish. The new fish was in the lobby aquarium, a large cylindrical tank that had been installed as part of a building renovation, and that Emma had noticed on her last visit and had been thinking about since. It was, by her assessment, an extremely good tank. While Nathan was upstairs, Emma was in the lobby studying the fish with the focused attention she gave to anything biological and interesting when Evelyn arrived. Saturday. No meetings. Evelyn came to the office on Saturdays when her apartment felt too much like a place where she was alone rather than a place where she was resting. She found Emma in the lobby. Later, Nathan would hear about this conversation secondhand, from Emma, in fragments, over the course of an evening. And what he put together was this. Evelyn sat beside Emma on the bench in front of the aquarium. She did not make it formal. She said, "Can I sit here?" Emma said yes. They sat for a minute, both looking at the fish. Then Evelyn said, "Emma, I want to tell you something." Emma had looked at her, serious face. "When your dad came to interview here," Evelyn said, "some people in that room weren't kind about the fact that you were there. And I was in the room and I didn't say anything to stop it. That was wrong. I should have." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Was it because of Professor Hopps?" "Partly," Evelyn said, "and partly because I made a wrong assumption. I thought the fact that your dad was taking care of you meant he couldn't also do the job. And I was wrong about that." Emma thought about this. "Professor Hopps is very distinguished," she said carefully. "Some people don't see it at first." Evelyn's expression did the thing it did. The involuntary, unguarded break in composure that happened when Emma said something that caught her off guard. "That's true," she said. "Some people don't." "My dad sees it," Emma said. "He's always seen it." "He's very good at seeing things," Evelyn said. "He is." Emma looked at the fish. "Are you sorry?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "I am." Emma appeared to weigh this. She was 6, almost 7 now, and she had a 6-year-old's understanding of apologies, which was actually not that far from an adult's. You looked to see if the person meant it. You checked their face. You decided. "Okay," Emma said. "I accept your apology." She said it very formally, the way she'd heard it said in some context that had apparently stuck. Then she pointed at the tank. "Do you know what kind of fish that one is?" "I don't," Evelyn said. "I'll tell you," Emma said. She told her apparently for the better part of 15 minutes. When Nathan came downstairs, he found them both on the bench. Evelyn leaning slightly forward with her elbows on her knees in a posture he'd never seen her use in any professional setting, and Emma beside her with Professor Hopps in her lap, mid-explanation of something involving the feeding habits of a specific variety of goby. He stopped at the edge of the lobby. He stood there for a moment. He watched his daughter, in her astronaut backpack and her small navy blazer, explaining biology to the CEO of a billion-dollar company who was listening with the complete attention of someone genuinely interested in what she was being told. He had a feeling that was hard to name, not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, more like the recognition of something that had shifted without you noticing it shifting, and you only saw it when you looked at a moment like this one and realized that the world had reorganized while you were inside it. He walked across the lobby. Emma saw him and waved without interrupting her explanation. Evelyn looked up. She didn't say anything, but she moved over slightly on the bench, and it was such a small movement and also completely unambiguous. He sat down. Emma finished explaining the goby. Then she moved on to the subject of the tang. Then she told them both, with great authority, which fish she would keep if she had a tank of her own, and her reasoning was detailed and specific and showed evidence of having been considered for some time. Nathan and Evelyn sat on either side of her and listened. Check. The Westbridge meeting happened on Thursday, as scheduled. It went well. Better than the optimistic projection, and not as well as the ideal projection, which meant it went like real things went. The Westbridge representatives were cautious but genuinely interested. The terms they proposed needed work. The governance protections Nathan had outlined in his pre-meeting memo were accepted in principle. There was a follow-up meeting scheduled for April. After the Westbridge representatives left, Evelyn and Nathan sat in the conference room alone for a few minutes. The city stretched out below the glass walls in the particular way it did on clear March afternoons when the light was still winter-thin but the air had started to change. "That went better than I expected," she said. "The governance language held the room," he said. "When you presented the independence provisions, you could see their general counsel recalibrate. He'd been prepared for a more defensive posture. You wrote those provisions. You presented them. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "We're going to have this argument again." "It's not an argument. It's a distinction." "It's an argument you're trying to make sound like a distinction." But she said it without real friction. The tone of two people who had been in enough rooms together that certain things had become their particular shorthand. He looked at the table. He looked at her. The Westbridge deal, he said. If it closes, and I think it will close, Orion comes out of this in a stronger position than it went into the merger. Different position, but stronger. The governance structure is more explicit. The oversight mechanisms are real rather than assumed. The people in the room know what they're doing. He paused. That's not how it looked 6 months ago. No, she said. It isn't. I'm saying... He stopped. He tried to find the right words for what he was trying to say, which was not a comfortable exercise because what he was trying to say was something he didn't have clean language for. I'm saying that things coming from the worst version of something to a better version, that's not an accident. That's the product of specific decisions made by specific people in a situation where the easier decision was different, and you made those decisions. She was quiet. I know you're still in the middle of the harder parts, he said. The testimony, the deposition, the parts where you have to keep naming what happened until the process is finished with it. I know that's not done. He looked at her steadily. I'm just saying, separately from all of that, what you built here in the past 6 months is real. She held his gaze. There was something in her face he'd seen only a few times, the unguarded version, the one that existed when she wasn't performing competence or control or leadership, but was simply a person receiving something that mattered. Thank you, she said. Not performed, not deflected, just 2 words, direct, meant. You're welcome, he said. April came. The testimony happened. It was hard in the way Nathan had told her it would be, and in some ways he hadn't fully anticipated, because hard things were always partly predictable and partly not. Victor Hale's defense used the executive oversight argument as expected, and the prosecution's presentation of the concealed access point and the deliberate security integration gap dismantled it as Nathan had said it would. He was not in the courtroom. He was not part of that process. But Evelyn called him from outside the courthouse on the second day between sessions and said, "The concealed access point, they're using your documentation." Good, he said. The defense tried to argue the gap was operational error rather than deliberate concealment. The timestamp analysis you built makes that argument very hard to maintain. That's what it was built for. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear the city around her, traffic, wind, the ambient sound of somewhere public. I'm okay, she said. In case you were wondering. I was, he said. I didn't want to ask. I know. A pause. Emma told me this morning. I saw her when you dropped her off. She told me that the thing about hard things is you just have to keep standing up at the right times and sitting down at the right times, and eventually you've gotten through it. Nathan sat in his office and felt something shift in his chest. She's told me that before, he said. It's good advice. She's a good advisor, he said. She comes by it honestly. A pause that was different from the other pauses. Warmer, less managed. Go back in, he said. You're okay. I'm okay, she agreed. She hung up. He put down the phone. He looked at the window. He looked at the work on his desk. He got back to it. Victor Hale was convicted in May. The verdict came on a Wednesday afternoon. Guilty on 4 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of conspiracy. The sentence would be determined at a separate hearing, but the conviction itself was complete and unambiguous. Brandon Pierce, who had cooperated extensively in the months leading up to the trial, received a civil judgment and a bar from serving as an executive or officer of any public company for 10 years. His attorney called it a settlement. The financial press called it a cautionary tale. Nathan didn't call it anything. He read the verdict, he made a note, and he moved on. At 4:30 on the day the verdict came in, Evelyn came to his office doorway. You saw, she said. Yes. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She was not performing anything. She was just standing there, the way a person stands when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and have just set it down, and their body doesn't quite know yet what to do with the absence of the weight. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it. She was not someone who answered questions about feeling casually. Like something is finished, she said. Not fixed, not gone, just finished. That's about right, he said. Does it get easier? The finished part? He thought about it honestly. It gets more manageable, he said. The distinction is real, even if it's not what you were hoping to hear. It's what I expected to hear, she said. From you. He looked at her. She was looking at him. The late afternoon light came through his window at a long angle, the way it did in May when the days had gotten long enough to reach into the office in the late afternoon, and it made the room look different from how it looked most of the day. Dinner, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Not the two small tables place, something better, because that's what today calls for. Emma, she said. Emma can come, he said. She'd want to. Something crossed Evelyn's face that he'd been watching develop for months, slowly, in the spaces between the professional and the personal. A warmth that was not performance, not management, not the controlled warmth of a CEO who understood that likability was a business asset. Just warmth, directed at the specific and irreducible fact of him and his daughter, uncalculated and real. Yes, she said. She'd want to. He called Emma. Emma said, with the immediate authority of someone who had been waiting for this development, I'm going to need 15 minutes to get ready. She needed 22. She arrived in her navy blazer with Professor Hops under her arm and her hair done in two uneven braids that she had very clearly done herself, and she greeted Evelyn with the particular combination of dignity and delight that was one of Emma's most specific qualities, taking something seriously and enjoying it completely at the same time. The restaurant was better than the two small tables place. Not fancier, just more room to breathe, a corner table with a window and good light. Emma ordered the pasta and studied the menu as though it contained information she needed to preserve. Evelyn ordered something she'd never had before because Emma suggested it, and Emma's food recommendations, she'd learned, were worth taking seriously. They ate. They talked about the things you talked about when the crisis had passed, and what was left was just the people. Emma's assessment of her teacher's reading recommendations, mixed, Evelyn's upcoming trip to meet the Westbridge partners in person, Nathan's entirely sincere opinion that Emma's self-done braids were not as bad as they looked. Emma disagreed. They negotiated. The negotiation resolved in the way it usually did, which was not with a winner, but with a sufficiency. At one point, Emma said to Evelyn, very seriously, "Are you going to keep working with my dad?" Evelyn looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the table. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Good," Emma said. "He's better at his job when he has somewhere to be." She picked up her fork. "That's just an observation." Nathan said, "Thank you, Emma." "You're welcome," Emma said serenely, and returned to her pasta. Evelyn caught his eye across the table. Her expression was doing the thing, the involuntary break, the escaped warmth. She didn't try to contain it. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Here is what happened in the 3 months after that. The Westbridge Strategic Alliance closed in June on terms that maintained Orion's full governance independence and established a partnership structure that two separate financial analysts described as favorable. The restructured arrangement gave Orion access to distribution channels it hadn't had before without the vulnerability that a full merger would have introduced. Hartley called it operationally sound, which from Hartley was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The board reconfigured its subcommittee structure at the June annual meeting. Forsyth and Abt remained on the board, but the subcommittee composition was changed in ways that reduced the communication asymmetry Nathan had documented. Callaway described the change as a governance improvement. Forsyth voted for it because the alternative was a more direct confrontation with findings that were now part of the official regulatory record, and he was too careful for that. Nathan's role was formalized in a way that hadn't been fully articulated when he started. Not a new title exactly, but a documented scope that reflected what the role had actually become. Risk oversight, executive protection, process integrity, with standing authority to pause any operational or legal workflow pending review. It was the kind of authority that felt abstract until you understood why it existed, which was that the worst thing that had nearly happened to this company had nearly happened because no single person had both the access and the mandate to say stop. Let me look at this. He now had that access and that mandate. He used it carefully. He was not reckless with it. The power to stop things was only useful if you were right more often than you were wrong. And being right more often than you were wrong required the same slow, careful, unglamorous work it had always required. He kept doing the work, and separately from the work, in the spaces that existed around it, in the accumulated evenings and occasional weekends, and the small moments of Thursday afternoon when the building had quieted down and there was nothing urgent pressing. Something else was being built. Not quickly, not perfectly, not with the clean narrative momentum of a story that knows where it's going and moves there without detour. More like the way real things built, incrementally, with interruptions, with the occasional step in a direction that turned out to be wrong, with conversations that didn't resolve into anything tidy, and other conversations that resolved into things you hadn't expected. With the slow accumulation of a person becoming known to another person, genuinely known, the way you only came to know someone through time and proximity, and the willingness to be in the same room when things were not going well. Evelyn learned over those months that Nathan made better coffee than the office machine and had been making it silently for months. That he remembered things people told him once and never forgot them. That he was harder on himself than he was on anyone else, which was both a strength and a problem. That he had a laugh he didn't use often, and that when it came out completely, without the managed quality that governed most of his interactions. Nathan learned that Evelyn ate lunch at her desk almost every day, not because she was too busy, but because she found 40 minutes alone in the middle of the day genuinely restorative and had never figured out how to explain that without sounding antisocial. That she had strong opinions about architecture that she never mentioned professionally. That she was better with Emma than she thought she was, and that Emma's frank and unsentimental affection was doing something to Evelyn's understanding of her own capacity for the same. Emma, for her part, had already made her assessment and filed it as complete. She told Nathan on a night in July when he was putting her to bed, and she was in the particular expansive mood that came over her sometimes at the end of good days. Evelyn's like the anglerfish. He sat on the edge of the bed. How so? Emma thought about how to say it. She has the light, but she didn't make it herself. You did. She looked at him seriously. And she gave the bacteria a safe place to live. He looked at his daughter. He thought about the bacteria that made the light, and the fish that carried it, and the arrangement that let both of them exist in the deep water where nothing else could. That's a very good observation, he said. I know, Emma said. She held Professor Hops to her chest. Are you happy, Dad? He sat with the question the way he sat with all important questions, not rushing to fill the silence, but giving it the room it deserved. Yes, he said. Even though it was hard? Because it was hard, he said. Mostly. She seemed to find this an acceptable answer. She settled into her pillow. She closed her eyes. He sat there a moment longer before he turned out the light. He looked at his daughter's face in the last of the evening light, the serious brow, the slight parting of her lips in early sleep, the compressed ears of Professor Hops visible beside her. And he thought about what it meant to walk into a room where you were not wanted and do what you came to do anyway. He thought about how Emma had sat against that wall in the interview room, drawing the chandelier quiet and watchful, not frightened by any of it. He thought about how she had always understood, in some wordless way, what he was and what he was capable of, before anyone else did and before he sometimes believed it himself. He turned out the light. On a Friday evening in late July, Nathan and Evelyn walked out of the Orion building together at 6:47. Emma was between them, slightly ahead, walking with the particular purpose of a child who has a destination in mind. They were going to the corner place that had the good soup dumplings, Emma's current primary food interest, and